G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day. Now, not a day goes past where there is not a new piece of footage or a new story off the front line or a new weapon being developed, all of which increase the lethality of what is happening on the front line, but as well, question the legality of what is happening as well. So I've put together this podcast with two other amazing guys. So Andrew is an incredibly experienced military engineer who will give technical analysis to the weapons being used, as well as the differences between the mines and IEDs and all of this. And Glenn is an international criminal lawyer and defense analyst. So he's all over the legal aspect of exactly what is happening, not only on individual cases, but overall as well. And I myself am a former infantry soldier, now war reporter. So I want these guys here to give the analysis from a much higher level than you and I probably, to give that technical aspect of what exactly is happening and maybe what laws of armed conflict are being violated. Now, I do believe that this is some of the most important work that I have ever done. Laws of armed conflict exist to save lives and reduce suffering on the battlefield. War is a part of humans, but we should try, one, not to have war, and two, if we have to have war, not increase suffering on the battlefield. And we have seen this through many aspects evolving of war, everywhere we look back, and gas being involved. Now, this video is for educational purposes, but I believe that this is more important than ever, as we are seeing an increase in the lethality of weapons and a reduction in the standards actually being enforced on the front lines. Or even worse, these standards being completely ignored. And this is a very slippery slope. Truth cannot damage a just cause. Lads, g'day. Cowie, welcome back to the channel. And
G'day,
we brought a guest with you, Glenn.
We bring qualified people this time.
We bring qualified people. Well, can you both just introduce, I guess, yourselves, who you are, your backgrounds? And I know some people are familiar with yourself, Cowie, but with Glenn, I'll get you to do it sort of in depth and where you come into the fold as well.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm from an engineer background, and we've been doing a bit of discussion about CBRNE events in and around Ukraine. And the last time that we spoke, Willie, there were a couple of curly questions that had ethical aspects, that had legal aspects, that had, the no holds barred wartime aspects. And I kept thinking, we've got to speak to a lawyer, and coincidentally, I crossed paths with Glenn. So Glenn was the legal officer on my SOTG rotation around 2009, 2010. And so that's how we know each other. And he's doing a lot of stuff in this field now. So Glenn, if you want to give a short background as to what you're up to these days.
Just for those unaware, SOTG is Special Operations Task Group, which was in Afghanistan at the time.
Thanks, guys. I'll try and be pretty brief. I don't want to make it the Glenn Kolomeitz show, but I'm Dr. Glenn Kolomeitz now. That's relevant actually, because my PhD is in command responsibility for war crimes. So it goes to this stuff, and I'm also teaching international criminal law and international humanitarian law at Wollongong Uni. I'm in the middle of marking our course right now. I was a soldier for many years, then commissioned as an Air Force. I don't tell many people this, so keep it to yourselves. But an Air Force operations officer trained in targeting. Did that for a while. Went back to the Army as a military police officer. Went to New South Wales Cops as in cranial investigations and counterterrorism. Then went to Parliament House as defence advisor for a little while. Then back to the Army as a legal officer and had Timor and a couple of rotations in Afghanistan. I went to military prosecutions, and then got out and went to the private bar for a while, and representing veterans and getting Afghan locally engaged employees out and all this sort of stuff. I've been doing that for a while. But my big focus now, obviously, is the international criminal law, so the war crime stuff. I've got my own firm, my own practice, Cardinal Legal and Cardinal Strategic. So I'm essentially an international lawyer and a defence analyst, because obviously the analytical background as well. Had some time in Ukraine. I've been advising some international Legion force elements for a while on operational legal issues. Had some time in Ukraine, looking at firstly trying to establish Russian targeting patterns with a view to building up that circumstantial brief surrounding genocide. which is obviously, we know it's very, very difficult. And while I met with some of the Rada, some of the chairs of the Rada, so the Ukrainian parliament, talking about how we can use Legion force elements to assist in preserving evidence of war crimes and that sort of stuff. So yeah, some pretty active stuff on the ground in Ukraine. Potentially another contract coming up soon, but we'll see what happens with that. And I've been doing a bit of advice here and there on some issues in Israel. In between, teaching at the next generation of international criminal lawyers at Wollongong Uni. And I think that's about all I need to really talk about myself at the moment.
Oh, overly qualified for us, mate. And we really appreciate, I guess, you coming to chat with us and look over like what is actually the letter of the law of what we see, because myself as a soldier, Cody's a soldier, officer, however you want to put it, but putting down that going, like, what actually is this? Because I have things that I see every single day committed by Russia or committed by Ukraine or by Israel and think that doesn't seem kosher. Like it just, it with me sits badly, but actually where is that letter? And can you explain, like, say on an SOTG trip, that special operations trip, being a tour in Afghanistan, what actually is your job? Like, what are you advising down through the command down to the soldier level?
This is really it's a really good question, mate. It's really relevant to the discussion today too. My first rotation was a winter rotation, so not a lot of action outside the wire. So we had time to work up dynamic targeting packages to essentially put Predator or Reaper drones over objectives. We did one of those. So an objective is like a bad guy, right? A senior bad guy who is identified as being targetable, a high priority target. I don't know whether you guys have spoken about the JPEL previously. You may. Do you want me to talk about it now briefly? It's relevant.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
The JPEL is the joint priority or joint prioritized effects list, which is a list that is put out of key insurgent leaders who a group of coalition staff decide need to be removed, so captured or killed. And each area of operations, so whichever country or countries have the lead in these areas, they look at whether they can identify these JPEL objectives. They call them objectives. So these JPEL objectives, if they can, they then work up a targeting brief, a targeting package to try and capture or kill that person. So on rotation 11, again a winter rotation, we after about 3 months of back and forward from the ops, from the what they call the 3-shop and the 2-shop, the intelligence cell, we worked up a package where I was happy that we could put a Predator or Pred Reaper, so a drone over this bloke, and in certain circumstances we could prosecute that target, so we could kill that objective, kill that person, which we did. So the big role there really was looking at the intelligence, trying to tick all the boxes, all the legal the targeting boxes, the legal targeting boxes. So can this person lawfully be targeted? Can we capture him rather than kill him? What's the best way? If we can't capture him, can we kill him and have the usual military necessity versus the proportionality? We have to make sure there was zero collateral damage estimate. So we couldn't plan to have civilians die as a result of prosecuting the target. So all this sort of stuff. It took about 3 months to get the pack together until I said, "Yep, we're good to go." And then this guy came up, and next thing it's the CO and the S2, so the intelligence officer, and myself looking at the feed from the drone. And once we ticked a whole lot more boxes, the other boss said, "Glenn, are we good to go on this?" I was like, "Glenn, can we do this?" I said, "Boss, we're good to go," and boom. And we achieved the boss's intent, and we achieved the broader intent by the effects that we needed were to remove that threat group from our area of operations, and we did. Once the leader was gone, that threat group never restabilized, and the battlefield effects were achieved. So, and clinically, it's like textbook, legally, totally above board. So that's one key role of the legal officer with SOTG, and the conventional forces don't do this sort of targeting. This is an SOTG role, this sort of dynamic targeting. The other role is training, making sure the commanders have to, by law, under the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, the commanders have to be satisfied their troops are trained and rehearsed in law of armed conflict, the rules of engagement. So a bit of that. And again, our guys are in theatre so often that it's really you sort of have to drive home changes and drive home a lot of these, just to make sure that the really it's protecting the commander and protecting Australia's reputation. So you're making sure they can go outside the wire and do their job without the wheels coming off. So it's not tying their hands, enabling them to do their job within the left and right of the legal arc, as we say. And doing training in the train. There's a training qual or a training compound, going out there and training ROE, rules of engagement scenarios, just to so that the company commander, in this case it was commandos, and the company sergeant major are happy that their guys can go outside the wire and do the job. And so we did ad nauseum scenarios. I don't know whether you were involved in any of that, but we did ad nauseum ROE scenario training in the training quala until. Which is good, right? Because that's sort of, that's me enabling the OC, the company commander, and the sergeant major to do their job with their blokes. A lot of ongoing on the run advice. So a lot of calls from the field about looking for legal advice on operational issues. I can give you examples of this sort of stuff. And a patrol was out coming into a location, and there was built up defences that they knew would be occupied on the way back out, and they wanted to destroy those built up defences, but they knew there was a bit of an ROE issue with that, so they called me from the field, and I gave them certain advice, and which they acted on, and I then went to Kandahar to fight the fight with the British headquarters staff about that little piece of ROE, which was just inappropriate, and we won that one because we were in the right, and the British headquarters staff were sipping lattes and not fully aware of what's happening outside the wire. So that sort of stuff, right? I think my biggest fight in my second rotation was with the British headquarters staff in Kandahar. To be honest, there was a lot of back and forward there, trying to make sure we could do our job, whilst I'm trying to deal with British conventional force lawyers. So I think the way I say it is, it's because it's special operations. It's not conventional by definition, and my job is to make sure they can enable them to do their job within the bounds of legality. Right? So, not sort of saying you can't do this, but helping these guys do their job, achieve the battlefield effects, achieve what they need to do within the left and right of the law. So, a lot of ongoing legal advice. And then there's all the run-of-the-mill stuff too, like bolting off to a key leadership engagement with certain people, with the local prosecutors and that sort of stuff, and handing over detainees in Kabul, processing detainees, making sure that everything's been done, tick, 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 make sure that's all good. Then check the evidence. If there's enough evidence, hand them over. If there's not, give them 500 Afghanis, a change of clothes, and say thanks for coming. See you next time. We pick you up. Which happened because apparently that 500 Afghanis, that goes a long way, right? So the more times they're picked up, the more times they can get a fistful of Afghanis and a change of clothes. Yep. But yeah, so look, a pretty dynamic job, particularly with special operations. If the legal officer is getting more than, I think, 4 hours sleep a night, they're not doing their job really. You honestly have to be engaged. You have to be involved in the operational planning, not forcing your way in. And I was pretty lucky with the second rotation. I was invited to every key parts of every planning session because they appreciated the fact that I'm just another staff officer, but I'm an enabler to help them do their job. I think that's a broad brush approach to the SOTG legal officer. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great breakdown of exactly, I guess, what your case is on that. And I think it is important to say that when you're in that job, you're working with special forces, therefore asymmetric, unconventional style warfare compared to the majority of warfare that we're seeing, say, happening in Ukraine currently is the conventional style, but we are seeing a lot of unconventional warfare. Yeah. Most relevant, I guess, for today is the Ukrainian soft targeting of Wagner PMC in Sudan over the past 48 hours, but also have seen that over the last year. And missions like that sort of falls into unconventional warfare. But as a whole, and we're going to get stuck into individual examples, and I know Coey's brought some footage of specific targeting of specific soldiers and the legalities around this, but in just a broad brushstroke of the Ukrainian-Russian war, the conflict going on that we're seeing, is there anything that just on the surface really makes your skin crawl that you think this just isn't kosher, whether it's from either side or the conflict as a whole?
The conflict as a whole is pretty horrendous. It's certainly an act of aggression, and aggression is a war crime now under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It's hard to make it applicable to this conflict, unfortunately, through the International Criminal Court. So there well may be a tribunal later which looks at prosecuting Russia for the crime of aggression. But just the very fact of the invasion and the intensity of the invasion, that's waging aggressive war, and it's a war crime, and it's a breach of the UN Charter. But that's that big picture, right? But there's the little picture on the ground. I've been to Bucha, as I dare say you guys well may have been. I've seen how Bucha is still in a pretty sorry state after some of the atrocities that occurred there. And during my work over there more recently, looking at the Russian targeting patterns, I was looking at Borodinka as one region I was looking at particularly, and where the Russians had targeted every school, but just every school in the district. So that's a clear targeting pattern, and you ask yourself, why would they do that? So, it's I have to try and approach it quite clinically and quite forensically, really, as a lawyer and investigator, and appreciating that a lot of people died in these scenarios, but you're sort of looking at it through this lens of establishing a brief in a very complex brief in a very complex battle space. So, look, I just think the behaviour, certainly the behaviour of Russian forces, and it's a lot of this. It must go to command authority. If they're targeting patterns of a certain nature, that's come from command. That's not just soldiers on the ground saying, let's just put fires on schools, right? So I think all goes back to the Kremlin, but so that whole pattern of the way they're conducting this war. But look, it goes both ways. There's been we know there's been some alleged crimes by Ukraine as well, and there is a UN independent monitoring mission looking into both Russian and Ukrainian allegations of war crimes. And so look, we can't look at one and go naughty Russia, nothing to see here, Ukraine, right? We say naughty Russia, and we say potentially naughty Russia, potentially naughty Ukraine. Let's start looking at the evidence, establish the facts, and then apply the law to those facts.
Yeah, and it must be difficult for yourself, trying to sit unbiased in that and putting the letter of the law down, because when you say, well, there's this targeting of schools, my thoughts is, but is that operating as a school at the time? Is it children playing in the yard having recess? Or is it a large open space that's a perfect place in shelter to have a collection of soldiers? And, we know, and it's well documented, like completely well documented, not a conspiracy at all, that Ukraine is using civilian areas like that, or typically what would say civilian areas for troops, for air defense systems, for build-up of weapons, whatever. It's been well known, well documented. And you say like that targeting of schools, is it Russia targeting the schools because we want to terrorize this area by hitting schools? Or is it, well, Russia's hitting these schools because Ukraine have chosen these areas to put their soldiers, because a school will have a big bunker and is a big area. They might have a bloody gymnasium we can have soldiers sleeping on the floor at. I think that's something that we need to point out as well.
Yep, absolutely agree. That's absolutely on the money. And it even goes a little bit beyond the use of the civilian infrastructure for military purposes, which of course then the infrastructure loses its protection, right? We'll talk about that more later, I guess. But it also, I'm not saying Ukraine's done this, but I think we can almost positively say Hamas has done this. Is it then allows them to say, well, hang on, the other side is targeting this civilian infrastructure, right? So they can then play lawfare with the facts. Lawfare is that term where they use the law to wage warfare against the other side in the public domain. So look, I think you're quite right, and that's why we have to look at all the facts, look at all the evidence, and if these locations are capable of having some military use, then we see whether they in fact did have a military use. We can never discount that. So it's a really good point. And I think your point about the playgrounds too, all of these locations, and my crime scene photos have all of this. All these locations have, you can see a playground in front of where the Russian fires have come from, which is pretty powerful imagery, right? But that at the same time, is there a like a local force, so the defending force, using that playground as some sort of protect, don't target this because it's a school with a playground, right? So we can't ignore that. You raise a really good point, mate.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting, someone who spent a lot of time in Ukraine myself, and we see this, like you said, that lawfare, or that even leading into propaganda. It's very easy to release a footage of, this playground has been bombed. Mm-hmm. And we see this, of course, in Gaza at the moment, if not to a larger scale of, but it's maybe more difficult than that you can see this mosque has been bombed, say, over there. And then you go, and then that spreads everywhere. But then you go, well, there's tunnels beneath this and rockets getting fired out of it. Where does that sit? And I think with people in Ukraine, Russia, they have this whole idea that Russia is specifically targeting schools full of kids. What's going on? I'm not saying that there hasn't been issues in their targeting massively. I've been in bombings, but there's also maybe a concern of where the troops are being placed, and or the building is now just a building. It wasn't. What makes a school is the kids and teachers and protected status. Same with the hospital. And tell me if I'm wrong, but that's what makes it that protected status. It loses that when there's bloody troops in it. Am I on the money?
You're on the money. Absolutely right. And it loses the protection, but it also exposes, obviously exposes civilians to risk, and it also sends a message to the other side. I'll give you an example. I like examples, right? Because I teach uni students, so I'm going to do the same thing for you guys today. You get a degree at the end of it, right? So, but it also sends a message to the other side saying, well, look, they're using schools as bases of operation, or they're putting their armor or their air defense, whatever, in these schools. So, as a matter of practice, and we'll say, for example, Ukraine, as a matter of practice, Ukraine is doing this. So therefore, now we are going to be targeting these schools because we know that they're doing it as a pattern of operations. So, it's a war crime on the part of the side that's doing it too, obviously, right? Because if it's lost its protection, then broadly speaking, there's no war crime on the part of the attacking force if the object's lost its protection, factoring in a whole lot of other stuff, but broadly speaking. But there's a war crime in using those civilian objects for military purposes. So, it's a really nasty piece of I was going to say modern warfare. I suspect it's happened for a long time, but let me give you a quick example. And this is I'm going to give you a couple of Australian examples if I can, because we're pretty good at our LOAC and our ROE. We tend to train well and operate well. But in East Timor, and as we know, Timor wasn't international armed conflict. It wasn't the sort of scale and complexity that we see elsewhere. But we had an ambulance taking our troops and their weapons and ammunition down to the range for a shoot. Straight away, the vehicle is, even putting aside the fact that Timor wasn't international armed conflict, it's still a protected vehicle. It's now being used for military purposes. But the message that sends to potentially to the baddies is, well, they're using this ambulance to move troops and weapons and ammunition around. So they're probably using all ambulances. So that exposes all ambulances to risk. I'm stating the obvious, I think, but that then applies to the schools and the hospitals and whatever else are being used for military purposes. They're protected for a reason, and the loss of that protection is problematic on a number of levels.
Oh, absolutely. And you touched on, and I know, sorry, Cowie, you're sitting there going, I've prepared all this stuff to look at. I'm sorry. And you look, Glenn has already said that he's already happy with people who are listening to, if when there's examples that pop up in the future, that we can bounce things off him as well. Because of course, if anything, it's very case by case. But you bring up like the Rome Statute and Russia's war of aggression towards Ukraine and the legal implication of this, and that it could be a war crime. Can you talk us over firstly, like, has there been any idea that it has been like convicted of that? What would it take for them to be criminally, I guess, charged? And how, I'm sorry to put all this on you, but how is this different from what we have done in countries, say, like Iraq? How does this differ?
Starting point with the war of aggression is not going to be prosecuted by, if Russia's ever hit with this aggressive war charge, or the Russian leadership, it won't be prosecuted by Ukraine, and it won't be prosecuted by the ICC. That's my prediction based on the law as it stands, right? I just don't think it's viable It'll be a standalone tribunal, probably
Run by who, like The Hague?
Oh no, it'll be it'll be an ad hoc tribunal, they call it. Like, it'll be a tribunal especially established to prosecute Russia, so the heads of the Russian leadership for the crime of aggression. The special tribunal for Russian aggression or something. It's like the Rwanda and former Yugoslavia ad hoc tribunals. They were stood up under their own statutes by the UN in that case, but regardless. To address those particular conflicts. So I suspect there will be some sort of special tribunal down the track. There's a lot of people pushing for that, including Malcolm Turnbull, former Prime Minister. He's been part of a group of elders pushing for that particular pathway because they can see that the ICC won't be able to prosecute that crime, and nor can or will or should Ukraine. The more I hate to say run of the mill, but I guess the more on the ground sort of war crimes, ICC does have jurisdiction. ICC has investigators on the ground now, have had some time. Even though Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute, Ukraine isn't either. But Ukraine agreed to be bound by it, so straight away there's this nexus there. It's happened on the land or on the territory of a state party or a party that's agreed to be bound by the statute. So there's jurisdiction immediately, ICC jurisdiction immediately, broadly speaking, for the Article 8 war crimes type stuff. Okay, so the stuff in the Rome Statute covering war crimes. The problem is the ICC can't prosecute in absentia, so ex parte. In other words, the defendant has to be in the dock, has to be present for the trial. The ICC's issued warrants for both Putin and Madame Belova, I think, the children's commissioner for as you know, for the abduction of Ukrainian kids, or there actually is war crimes to talk about this, this removal of these kids. They'd have to be picked up and in the dock to be prosecuted by the ICC. Ukraine's prosecuted a few Russian private soldiers. They started off originally prosecuting them under domestic homicide type laws, and I've got my Ukrainian criminal code here somewhere right next to me. I did an advice on this a while back, actually, for a couple of senior Legion guys in Kyiv about Ukraine's ability to effectively prosecute a lot of this stuff. Ukraine wants to prosecute Russians, right? And for a while there, Zelensky was coming out saying, "I'm going to prosecute we're going to prosecute the Kremlin, prosecute Putin." Well, for command responsibility or superior responsibility, it ain't going to happen. Ukraine's not going to be doing that, right? They well may end up prosecuting some war crimes under their criminal code. It won't necessarily be Rome Statute. It'll be the same as Rome Statute crimes, but there's a lot of mechanisms there, a lot of wheels turning in this space. And I can see that Ukraine wants to do it. Whether they should or whether they can is another story. The ICC can do it, but there's a bunch of constraints there. External, like ad hoc tribunals, can potentially do it, and they may have less constraints, and they may be seen as more legitimate than Ukraine doing it too. So look, I think eventually I'm talking about Russian crimes now. Eventually there may well be some bigger prosecutions happening. Ukraine, any identified offences by Ukrainian soldiers, so Ukraine forces, Ukraine has an obligation to investigate and an obligation to prosecute if there's a brief there, their own people. Right? We know that. If they won't, then the ICC can step up and they can do it. So
that happened because there's clear evidence from things I've seen of executions of targeting that is, I don't have to be a lawyer and you don't even have to be a soldier ethically to go, that's not on, that is wrong. It doesn't matter the badge of which militia they're fighting for or if they're fighting under the Ukrainian armed forces. That's wrong. Has there actually anyone that Ukraine has picked up and gone, you're a Ukrainian soldier fighting on our side, but this is not kosher?
That's a really good question, and in fact, it's a really good juncture to ask it, because the short answer is no. The independent monitoring mission, so the UN mission that was in there to monitor any war crimes, etc., in the course of this fight, they found whatever the term is. I think it's identifiable evidence, or they raised a reasonable suspicion that crimes were committed by both Russian forces and Ukrainian forces. Now, they couldn't get into Russia to interview people. They couldn't get nothing. There's a barrier there. They could get into Ukraine. So they said to the Ukrainian government, these are the suspicions. They gave them the brief and they said, you have an obligation to investigate, and if there's a brief, prosecute. As far as I'm aware, to date, there's been no prosecutions. And the last time I read the last report from that independent monitoring mission, they weren't aware there'd been any investigations either. So that's a significant point, right? An independent UN mission has identified reasonable suspicion, or whatever their standard is, reasonable suspicion that international crimes had been committed by Ukrainian forces. The obligation is thereafter on Ukraine to investigate, and if there's a brief, to prosecute. And if they won't investigate, or if they say they've investigated and it's not genuine, therefore they're unwilling or unable to prosecute, then the ICC can pick it up. So look, we'll see what happens in the future with that. But like I say, it goes both ways. We can run around saying yes, Russia's naughty, Ukraine's a victim in this, and they are a victim of aggression. But at the same time, the obligation is on both sides to comply with the rules of war, or the laws of war as they apply in the conflict.
Yeah, and is this dating back just from the 22nd that no one has been charged, or back from 2014? Because we know that throughout that period of almost 10 years now, that there has been elements of that. And if you're saying that now Ukraine hasn't charged anyone, picked them up, and the ICC have then a obligation to, is the ICC actually going to do that, or are they going to go back and go, well, the political fallout will see if this, and we'll look like the bad guys? We're not going. Like, are they actually going to do it and go, well, those guys that mowed down the Russian soldiers on the ground with their hands up, which the footage is clear as day, are they actually going to get picked up, or is it just going to be like many other war crimes that have happened previously, just sort of left in the wind because that doesn't fit the West's narrative of these countries that have signed into the ICC?
Another good question. You're on fire today, mate. I tell you, it's very good.
I've been waiting to talk to someone like you for ages, because I lie awake at night all the time just thinking there's one side that is you're constantly seen in the wrong, one side constantly in the right. And I agree with that blanket overall, that Ukraine is a country that has had an aggressive state come into it. But at the same time, I'm like, but it doesn't matter who you are. You still have to comply by this. And the Taliban, they saw to none of these, like even less than Russia does. They see to none of it. They don't have any ROE. They don't have any orders for opening fire.
And Taliban do have ROE. They have ROE. I'll talk to you about it later if you like.
They do? Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, I'll go through it with you in another interview if you like.
Well, for sure. But even less than, say, Russia has.
Yeah.
And then there's Australians and other soldiers being held up for crimes like this. That, if we want to be the letter of the law, we need to hold everyone to that letter of the law, no matter if they're in Ukrainian armed forces, Russian armed forces, foreign fighters, whatever. I think it's very important.
Yep, absolutely right. A quick, just a piece of apprehended bias potentially. Full disclosure: my grandmother was Russian, but my grandfather was Ukrainian, from a town called Kolomeitz, hence the surname Kolomeitz, right? Kolomeitz in Western Ukraine. So, Russian grandmother, Ukrainian grandfather. When I wake up in the morning, I want to fight myself. Right? That's the old log boy joke, right? But no one ever laughs, so it's a dad joke probably, but nonetheless. So look, but there's no bias here. Right? You go in objectively, and of course, I think I know that Russia's a victim state. I'm sorry, Ukraine's a victim state, but you're quite right. The conduct in warfare, it applies to all players in the battle space. And the independent monitoring mission started looking at the conduct of both sides since the invasion, so not going back to Crimea. There may have been other inquiries back to then. I suspect there probably has been, right? But there's not a lot out there in the public domain. I'll do some research. You've prompted me to do some research into it, so I'm going to now. There's a few late nights for me now. Thanks, boys. But look, the allegations are they're in the hands of the Ukrainian prosecutor general, and there's a new prosecutor, not new. He's been there for a couple of years now, prosecutor general. The other one was sacked by Zelensky. So look, the allegations are there. They have an obligation to investigate. And as we know, if they don't investigate, or if they say they have, but then it's it's not a genuine investigation. So that the triggers for ICC jurisdiction, they'll come into play. I suspect that the ICC is sitting back. There's no statute of limitations on this stuff, right? So I suspect they are sitting back, not wanting to tread too heavily at the moment because of the public, the global perception of having Russia as the aggressor and Ukraine as the victim, and not being seen to be going after the victim state when they can't physically go after the aggressor state, and they can't. Right? They just can't at the moment. They physically, other than those warrants, there's nothing else they can do. I suspect that politics have come into play there for that reason. But eventually, the world community will be saying, well, what's happening with these allegations? And I suspect the UN, this independent monitoring mission, which is headed by an Australian lawyer, by the way, I suspect she'll come back and say, what's happening with these allegations? Are they being investigated? And eventually Ukraine's going to have to say, these are the steps we've taken. They may be doing something. Like, I don't know, but that's irrelevant because they have to be doing something in any event.
Yeah. And what is the difference, if there's any, between what Russia has done to its neighbor Ukraine as what the Western countries, Britain, America, primarily, I guess, did in Iraq? How is this seen differently? That going down the path of bloody putting Putin on trial and these people on trial. On the other side of the coin, I'm not a lawyer. I'm thinking, well, how is what Bush and Blair did any different to what we're seeing? Hey, if anything, if we look at numbers of people killed as civilians, it's probably still lower at the moment.
Yeah, look, that's a good, putting aside the civilian deaths for the moment, so that the collateral, we'll say collateral damage, the civilian deaths for the moment. The decision to go into Iraq it's been very controversial. It has been forever, right? But the grounds to enter into these sorts of things is Afghanistan in our case, right? So it's invitation of the host nation or the host state, subject to under a Security Council resolution, and there are certain humanitarian bases that you can go in under, or self-defense. Now, or defending another state, going in to help that state. In this case, the original fight with Iraq and Kuwait, different set of circumstances here, right? But the subsequent invasion of Iraq was justified on what's been found to be pretty spurious grounds. But nonetheless, they eventually had some sort of justifications which were never challenged to the point that that they were found totally wrong, should never have done it. So I think they found some sort of top cover along the way, and eventually UN resolutions came through and followed. The Security Council resolutions followed up, and it sort of justified itself, I think. But look, the conduct on the that's going to war. That's a bit of a different issue to the conduct in war. There's two Latin words. I'm not a 2,000-year-old Roman, right? So my Latin's not very good. But there's the jus ad bellum, which is the legal justification for going to war. Then there's the jus in bello, which is the way you apply the law in conflict. So how you behave in conflict. My stuff is more about the in bello stuff. So how you conduct yourself in conflict. The actual going to war. I think politicians can argue that at the ICJ, whatever, the International Court of Justice, they can do all that sort of stuff. Giddy up. Unless I get a gig there, I'm not really casting my mind to it too much. But other than the aggression, because aggression is a breach of the UN Charter, so it's at that higher level. It's also a war crime. But look, going into Iraq was undoubtedly problematic, and as we know now, it didn't actually achieve. Well, I don't think anyone really knows what effects they wanted to achieve, and this is part of Australia's problem in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Is we go into these conflicts without any real strategic intent, so any indication of what we hope to achieve. So it's like when you say, what's your exit strategy? Well, exit from what? Like, is there a milestone that we have to achieve before we can exit? Well, what's that milestone based on? That would be based on some sort of overarching strategy. If there's no overarching strategy, how do you know when you've achieved the job, right? So I think that's been the problem with modern wars, with Iraq and with Afghanistan, particularly for us. Not Timor. Timor's a totally different set of circumstances, different sort of conflict. But that's when it opens up this quagmire, and you get bogged down for 20 years, and then the wheels start coming off, right? And then you start seeing the problems with having no real strategic guidance, at that higher level. Well, what are we doing here? Then it starts to break down. You start to see issues with the use in bello, so the way the jobs are being done on the ground in these countries, and look, I suspect there's a lot of that in the Russia-Ukraine situation. And just putting aside Ukraine for a moment, I suspect that a lot of these Russian conscripts are going in there saying, we don't really know why we're here. We were told to be here. Government can't give us any good reason. The special military operation doesn't really cut it. We've got no real guidance. So they go out there and start just running amok. Right? I suspect a lot of that at play.
Yeah, well, as far as I'm aware, that Russia is trying to show that there was a genocide against its people in Ukraine, and that was the justification for crossing into that border. And I guess if they can prove that, which from my reading in this, to prove genocide is unbelievably difficult, say even with South Africa, with Israel and Palestine at the moment, that is very, very difficult to actually prove and action that. But I guess that is what they're going down. My point is more, why should people like me, who's part of the international community, have faith in the ICJ or ICC when we see it sort of constantly falling over? Like, how can we think that, or how can we in the right mind put Putin on trial if we're not willing to put these other leaders who have done similar on, if not the same or less grounds in other wars? It's a part of like, what is the trust in this system, as well as, and down to, I guess, a more localized case, the trust in Ukrainian courts and that system is already horrifically low. It's at a lower point than it was last year. From Kiev Institute of Research released that, I believe, yesterday or the day before, maybe it was a week ago. And the EU has already come through and said, this is one of the things Ukraine's now going to need to do if they want to come into the EU, is fix the court system and the direct appointing of judges and however it works from Ukrainian politicians. So that whole system, as just a member of the community, I don't feel there's that much faith in it. Like, we're going after Putin, but there's all these other people who, just because they've fallen on the right side, who we're never going to try. And I guess we can go back in war and say, well, far more Germans were maybe tried, or Japanese, than Western soldiers because of who won. Like, I know, and I guess this is a conversation for another 4-hour conversation another time, but it is an interesting thing, and that's how I see it.
I will just one quick. You're right. It's a whole other line of argument, but it's a good point. There's actually the bookshelves surrounding me. I'm surrounded by like this battery of bookshelves here, and one of them is full of books on the ICC and the Rome Statute, because that's my PhD and that's sort of my thing, right? And there's one of the shelves is all about the politicization of the ICC and the political nature of the court. And that's a fact. International courts, the ICJ particularly, but the ICC as well, are a political creature. The ICC is independent of the UN, but the ICJ is a creature of the UN, and the UN, by its own definitely, by its own admission, is a political creature. So you're absolutely right, and it is difficult for people to have confidence in those institutions. I think the ICC hasn't been tested as much yet. All of its cases so far have really been Africa or the subcontinent, or Africa, or Northern Africa. They haven't really gone beyond there. So people have criticised the ICC and said, well, you're just a court to go after African warlords because they're the low-hanging fruit, right? You won't go after any of the big countries, any of the big players. So there's a lot of criticism there. As they open up more cases outside of Africa, I suspect we'll start to see exactly how strong the ICC is. But the ICJ, there's a lot of criticism there about, when, like, even right now with the South Africa, Israel, with Germany stepping up to intervene, and other countries, they're calling on Australia to intervene on South Africa's side. That's all politics, right? That is all politics, and it's pandering to domestic audiences. So it's no wonder, and I agree with you, it's no wonder people go, what the hell, ICJ? And they go, what the hell, ICC? They just don't see the product, the intention of these organizations being achieved in practice.
Because then that feeds the propaganda that if no Ukrainian soldiers are, arrested, tried, convicted, however this goes, then I think that gives then Putin a lot of evidence to go turn around and go, well, look, your system's not holding up in what you've even signed onto or bought onto. This is evidence for why we came in. We came in because we believe this wasn't happening, and you're not holding the account here. I think, yeah, the system of not being held to its account and being politicized actually ends up hurting the victim of something significantly more.
Yeah.
Look,
you're right.
Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. one quick point. The US, the National Security Advisor for Economics in the White House, I've forgotten his name, he sent out a letter to Ukraine with a list of organizations. And he said in that letter, unless you can grip up corruption in these organizations, we'll start looking at cutting off the DOJ fund, Department of Justice funding. And of course, the judicial system was on there, the courts were on there, the Office of the Prosecutor General was on there. So, you're absolutely right. If the US is saying, get your act together, the corruption is still there in these organizations, and these go to the rule of law. People must see that the law applies equally across the board to everybody. Otherwise, there's no rule of law, and it's the place has collapsed. So, look, you're right. And the fact that the DOJ is the White House identified that and said, we're not going to fund you unless you clean this stuff up. That's a pretty significant telling point, I think.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Cowie, I'm going to invite you in now because I know you've worked more hard on this than anyone, and you've just been sitting there for 40 minutes in silence. I mean, like, what did you invite me on for, boys?
Sorry, Cowie.
No, very interesting. Very interesting. And again, Willie and I can sit around all day, every day, but we do not have these insights. We do not have this background, and it's great to hear it from someone that lives it and breathes it.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, it's fun. It's good to be here. I don't mind talking, right?
Makes it easy for us. We do want to go over, I guess, bits and pieces we missed last time, as well as, I guess, an update that you're giving. And I know you've got one of your Haroon-style slideshows to show us as well.
Right. So, where are we? All right, you guys see that all right?
Yep, perfect.
All right, so we'll just do a little bit of housekeeping and put a framework around 5 key follow-on questions that I summarized post our last chat. So the first one is the same disclaimer. The references I'm giving are either from Telegram or LinkedIn or whatever. That's all publicly available information. It doesn't cover everything. And this kind of leads into my content statement, which I didn't think I needed to sort of say last time, but I had a couple of mates make some comments, and I thought it's probably worthwhile saying I'm not a journalist and I'm not bound to be completely objective. I will present my point of view on how I see things. And if we talk about things like, there were lots of examples I remember we did last time, the rat disease in the trenches, and I think we were saying this about Russia, that about Russia. That whole situation applies to both sides. So all the examples, I'm not for or against either side, but I just happen to use the examples that I come across to give the context. Both sides are suffering massive attrition. Both sides appear to be doing things they shouldn't be doing. I'm not for or against. I'm just sort of seeing it. And I'm a CBRNE guy. I'm not really trying to get any other point of view across. So with that in mind, just to recap the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant situation. And the last time we talked about the fact that it was in cold shutdown, that the IAEA had personnel on the ground. There's a very well protected structure in terms of risk of radiological release or theft or whatever you want to call it. Someone did comment to me privately that the bigger concern was the spent fuel. So once the fuel gets used in the reactor and they transport it underwater out of the reactors, they keep it underwater for months and months and months and months. And that is less protected than the fuel that's in the actual reactors themselves. And that was what they were a bit more concerned about, deliberate or accidental, release or whatever you want to call it. To circle back to my previous statement, whoever blew up the dam, or if it just collapsed under its own weight, it's completely irrelevant to the point here. So whether the Russians did it, Ukrainians did it, I don't really care. It's not important. What's important is that this doesn't appear to be a risk. We did see some reporting about mines that were allegedly removed from the perimeter area are now back in place. If you want to talk on that one, Willie.
Yeah, look, I read the majority of these IAEA reports that come out. They come out every couple of days, or every time there's like an IAEA mission comes out. And look, there are mines that are on this area and around the perimeter. And every report so far has basically been like, yes, this is against the ethics of an area like this. You know, it should be excluded. But at the end of the day, these mines are not going to cause anything catastrophic here. Now, I'm not saying then therefore you're in the right. No, I disagree with having mines anywhere here. But an anti-personnel mine or anti-tank mine on the perimeter is not going to go through 5-meter thick concrete at areas like this. It's against the rules. It's against they have an acronym for like the safety of nuclear stuff and the 5 or 6 nuclear safety protocols they have in place, but it's not going to cause that. And it's more in the defense against personnel attacks. And we have seen Ukraine launch a bit over 12 months ago now, actually well over 12 months, probably 15 months ago now, attacks by RIBs into areas just to the east of the power plants are on foot. So there is a realistic reason to have defense and landmines of an area like this.
Yeah, definitely. And this situation here is watch this space. So is it anything right now? It's delicate, but we'll have to wait and see if anything further comes of it. The next one that I got asked about by a few people was, why did you guys not talk about DU and the threat from radiation and other hazards associated with DU? And I thought it's probably topical to talk a little bit about DU. It does pertain to a radiation hazard. It's quite a low one. This falls into one of those, it's not a false flag thing, but it's certainly, from a technical standpoint, is a reason why the Russian side could put their hand up and say, hey, the depleted uranium ammunition does come with a radiation hazard, and they're not wrong. So I thought we'll just spend a couple of minutes covering this, what DU is and why it's an issue. You can see on the graphics there, this just sort of summarizes an example in the bigger picture there of how a silver bullet or a saber round from a tank works. So the actual bullet part, or the highly accelerated projectile, is made of the depleted uranium, which I'll talk about in a sec. They also fit these to other weapon platforms, so helicopter cannons and fighting vehicle cannons and things like that. So they do come in a variety of sizes. What's important here is that there have been more than one announcement, but for this example, September last year, quite a lot of aid, of which 120 mil smoothbore rounds for the Abrams that were donated to Ukraine was included. So both the UK and the US have now said DU rounds have been provided with those main battle tanks. Now, what does that mean? Have we seen them being used? It's a lot murkier. So I'll just pull up some facts and figures for those that are new to DU or don't know much about it or have heard the name. It's been around for ages. It's been around for decades. It was used very, very extensively in the Gulf Wars. So depleted uranium, or DU, or Q metal, or D38, pertaining to its uranium-238, that's most of its makeup. It's the lower content. It has lower content of the uranium-235, right? So the uranium-235 isotope is the one that they want to extract to make enriched uranium, right? So they enrich raw ore to get a high content of 235, and that's what they put in nuclear weapons, and that's what they use as fuel for the fission nuclear reactors, which means they're left with a whole bunch of uranium-238, which is not useful for either of those applications. So natural uranium's got about 0.7 uranium-235, and the depleted uranium, it's had a lot of that uranium-235 taken out of it, so that's why they refer to it as depleted. Got about 0.3%. Now, natural uranium out of the ground is radioactive, so is depleted uranium. why they use it in these rounds, there's several reasons. Probably the main ones are they're left with it laying around after they've enriched uranium. So being so dense and useful as a projectile, they take something that's otherwise a waste product and they turn it into armament. And there's a couple other things to it. It's used in other applications like counterweights in aircraft, radiation shielding and medical radiation therapy, transporting radioactive materials. It also, at temperatures between 600 and 700 degrees Celsius, so when it's been fired and it hits the target, it is self-igniting. It's pyrophoric. So that makes it pretty handy when you're trying to destroy an armored vehicle. Now, why is it radioactive? Uranium is naturally radioactive. It's what they call an alpha emitter, right? Alpha particles. This is the shortest range and has the least penetration of the main radiations, alpha, beta, gamma, and X-ray. Now, your skin will stop alpha radiation. So there's no real risk of handling this stuff. It has virtually no hazards as a raw material. When it's fired at a tank or whatever, and it becomes a dust, right? Or you stir up dust, that residue from around the vehicle in the dirt, etc., and you ingest it or inhale it, that is when you can have serious issues. And there are a lot of cases going around where people are saying this is all DU related health issues. So bring it back to context of Ukraine, Russia. If DU rounds are used, yes, legitimately, if you're on the receiving end, you have a claim to say that there are low levels of radiation being contaminated in the war zone by the opposing side's use of these DU rounds.
My concern with these being used, again, is one, I guess, how Russia can see it, but Ukraine is basically a large food bowl. Is how is this going to affect down the line going, well, this dust goes into the soil, and people have this fear of radiation, whether it's a legitimate fear or a fear made through propaganda of things like, well, Chernobyl, if we're speaking Ukraine, or these weapons that we've seen used in Japan, but that there may have a further on effect of that, of the dust getting on clothes when people reoccupy, liberate things. And of course, Russia's claim, they can say that there are, uranium weapons being used, that these are a radioactive weapon. There is absolutely a case there. You can't say that it's not. I guess, how do you read into that, Glenn, of seeing the use by America back in the Gulf War and now the use here?
There's been another controversial topic, and I think it's the ongoing effects that are the concern there. Like at the time, the illegality, well, the legality rather, was assessed and found to not, the usual thing, the usual targeting assessments and weapons assessments were done under the additional protocols, so under the international law on point. But I think it's the ongoing, the residual nature of this sort of weaponry, or weaponry components, which is the greater issue, I think, and that's still a topic of debate. So, if it achieves its if it's used and it achieves its military necessity, achieves a military objective, and is proportionate to the civilian impact at the time, then it's lawful. But are we then factoring in the longer term implications? And that doesn't come into play. That doesn't come into play in a big way in looking at the collateral damage. So the implications on civilian on civilians and civilian infrastructure. So that's all changing clearly. People are starting to look at that, but everything's all these analyses seem to be are based on at the time of the targeting, at the time of the use of the ordnance.
And we know that militaries around the world would never lie about their investigations into substances or weapons being used, having effects on soldiers at the front line, and then being caught out 50 years down the line.
I will say, look, that's a good point too. I don't want to labour the point too much, but there is a process. If we're introducing new weapons or modifying weapons, there's a process, weapons analysis process under international law, where you have to do weapon reviews, and it's technical people and lawyers getting together and reviewing these proposed weapons or these proposed modifications, and they analyse it as against the IHL, so as against the the impact on civilians and whether the and on combatants, of course. So whether the suffering is going to be excessive, so unnecessary suffering, and in these you would hope that in these weapons review processes, you would hope they're looking at all of these longer term implications. But again, you're right. They weapons manufacturers want to sell weapons, and militaries want to use weapons.
And America needs to get rid of the depleted uranium that can't make bloody power anymore. That's there's a part of that, and yeah.
All right, so rolling on, that's DU in a nutshell, and there's a lot more to it. Again, this is just to skim the surface of that. What we didn't talk about it last time, and it's useful for context. The other one we didn't talk about, and we didn't talk about for a reason, which we'll get to at the end, is cluster bombs or cluster weapons. So for those that have never heard of them, don't know what they are, or have heard the term, but they're not 100% sure what they are, what they do, and why they're being used. Cluster ordnance is basically a carrier body of some kind that holds a whole bunch of little bomblets, and they all come in all sorts of different sizes and shapes. Here's a very early on photo of an aircraft dropping a what they call a sort of clamshell style cluster bomb. So the fusing system on that would reach a certain release point away from the airframe, and the fuse would pop the nose aside. The air would then force the two parts of the shell apart, and it would spread all those little BLU bomblets, and they have fins, little sort of raised sections on them, which as the airflow goes past them, it makes them spin. So they're centrifugally armed. And the whole idea is that once they're armed in the air, they hit the ground, they're impact functioned. Here's another example. So this is a CBU 100. They've got an anti-tank submunition called the Rockeye, right? So you've got the standoff nose probe there, and inside is a shaped charge. Very similar. These are old. These are decades old, but very similar in concept to the 3D printing we're seeing in the Ukraine, because you want to stabilize the fin and get the direction of that shaped charge pointed down as it impacts the target. So looking at some of the other ones, these are the more modern ones that we are seeing used. So DPICM is dual purpose, improved conventional munitions. There's very different types. So this one here, you can see the copper discs. This is a shaped charge, top down attack style setup. You've got a little ribbon that hangs off the back here. So as they're spread out in the air catches the ribbon and pulls a mechanism to the rear, allows some other parts to move, and it becomes armed, and it functions when it impacts the ground. So you can see here's a video of, this is an old video. I've used these, so I don't have any copyright issues, and it just sprays them around. There's heaps of different ways you can chuck these around. They can also be launched from a rocket. They can be launched from artillery. The problem with cluster munitions is they have a very high failure rate. So anywhere from a few percent to 20-something%. It all depends on what it is, how old it is, country of origin. But they turn into unexploded ordnance. And in some instances, they can turn into very, very sensitive unexploded ordnance, not too dissimilar to an anti-personnel landmine. So there's a lot of claims about the use of these. They're non-humane weapon systems. They're very effective against troops in the open. They're very effective against columns of armored vehicles, the shaped charge or the dual purpose, right? So shaped charge and fragmentation. But if you're going to scatter unexploded ordnance as a byproduct of that attack, you're leaving the ground contaminated with unexploded ordnance, as well as all the landmines that are around, as well as in certain areas, DU hazards as well. So it's just an additional thing. Both sides have claimed that the other are using submunitions. You can see there's all sorts of different types. So there's the ostrich egg types. You can see the wind vanes on the side. So that, again, is a spin armed. These are sort of the American style BLU frag producing ones. These are some of the Russian carriers. So they're the ones that carry all these submunitions. Both sides have them, whether they're modern or Soviet style. And it appears from all the stuff I've seen that both sides are using them. Now, why we didn't talk about this last time, Willie, and why it's not such a big deal in the context of some of the other legal stuff is because the CCM, which is the convention that governs not using them, which Australia has signed up to, the US hasn't signed it, Russia hasn't signed up, and nor has the Ukraine. So yes, it's an issue because there are a lot of these unexploded submunitions getting scattered around left, right, and center, both in Russia now and in Ukraine. That is an issue, but in legal terms, they're not bound by this CCM.
Can I build on that? Can I just jump in for a second?
Yeah, love you to.
Look, you're absolutely right, and like Russia and Ukraine aren't states parties to the CCM. There's a couple of little spin-offs from that too, and it's a little bit technical, but I'm going to try and keep it, keep it at undergraduate level, right? But with the weapons law, so the law of weapons, which comes under the broad IHL umbrella, prohibits any weapons that, as we know, are by their nature indiscriminate. So if the use of a weapon doesn't have, it's indiscriminate, so it doesn't discriminate between military objectives and civilian objects, etc. Prohibited straight up. That's a matter of customary international law, so it applies to everybody, regardless of whether they're a party to the CC, to the Cluster Munitions Convention. Having said that, they would clearly argue parties using these states using these weapons will say they're not indiscriminate. But you touched on a very good point there a second ago. You're talking about the fact that they don't all. A lot of them are residual, so they become what's known as explosive remnants of war. So they're still out there and they're still dangerous and they can still explode and therefore indiscriminately kill people, right? So that itself starts fitting into the indiscriminate nature of the weaponry. And I think a percentage was given a second ago, Coey, that I think you said there was a percentage of these weapons, these bits of kit that don't self-destruct or that remain live. Both Russia and Ukraine are states parties to the explosive. I'm just reading it because it's a bit of a complex thing. The Explosive Remnants of War Protocol, which that itself could smack them down the track, I think, because even though they're not parties to the Cluster Munitions Convention, they are parties to the Explosive Remnants of War Protocol. And if they're using these weapons that are then becoming explosive remnants of war, the fact that they are staying in, randomly around the place as a live, dangerous piece of ordnance, that's potentially a breach. And secondly, if it's found that the fact that they are remaining out long after the war is gone, then that ties into the indiscriminate argument, which is indiscriminate use of weaponry, which is a conventional piece of law, which means it applies to them. So, right now, yes, they can say they're parties to the convention, and neither of them are in the frame. But that's well subject to analysis and change down the track.
Yeah, I don't see how you could say that these are not indiscriminate when and I don't have the percentages on me, but from my reading on these cluster munitions, and even the American ones, the percentage is there's a listed percentage and then there's like a real world percentage that, in testing, it was something like 6%. But then all these people are going, well, I've worked with these munitions, and in a real world case where you've got soft ground and you're firing them at whatever different altitudes and distances, it's, far greater than that. And people saying, well, even if, let's go with the round figure of 10%, when these weapon systems have hundreds of these clusters in it, 1% is a shitload. And in my opinion, I think if the weapon is, creating UXOs, they know it is creating unexploded ordnance. That is directly in an indiscriminate weapon. And we have seen Ukraine very publicly and rightfully going at Russia, going, well, the amount of cluster munitions that you left when I was there in Kharkiv, the amount of clusters that were left on the ground, the bomblets that were left on the ground, were acting as landmines and were indiscriminately killing kids, cattle, making area completely, people cannot go into areas because of this. And we're pushing on that it meets all those use cases for an indiscriminate weapon. And I think down the path, if people choose to actually apply these, that measure would have to come into the fold.
Yeah. If you look at at both Vietnam, Cambodia, from how many decades ago that conflict was. There is still so much ordnance clearance to be done, and so much of it is submunitions that were dropped in that conflict. So this is back in the late 60s, 70s, right? Afghanistan, 80s, they dropped, they would drop these pedal mines, the butterfly mines, millions of them. Now, both America and Russia and other countries, the logic must still be there that the pros of the weapon effectiveness in this conflict and in these circumstances is effective enough, or it's all we can get, or we're not worried about down the track, we're just worried about survival. There must be a bunch of factors that are outweighing the fear of repercussions for what Glenn just outlined.
Yeah. Glenn, is there any concern with the 155 mil cluster munitions being deployed from the US to Ukraine? We know that that is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any concern if that is then used in, say, an Australian or French howitzer, whether it's a Caesar self-propelled gun or Australian M777 gun? How was that seen legal-wise? That we're supporting, Ukraine, great, but we're saying you can't use clusters. What happens if that 155 goes up the spout of one of our guns? How is that sitting with us?
You hit the nail on the head before, Matt, where you said use the word use, right? The use of that's the key term in all of these particular provisions. Even a party can be, or a state can be a party to a convention, and the use is defined quite broadly. I think legally, once we hand that weapon, so this goes to the old thing about how we apply some of our conventional obligations. You might recall in Afghanistan, we wouldn't fly US forces around the place if they were carrying anti-personnel mines, etc., because we extended our obligations, our understanding of our obligations under the treaty, quite broadly. Once we're providing these weapons to Ukraine in good faith, and they're not in breach of their obligations, politically, I think it's touchy, but legally, I don't think it places us in any jeopardy legally. It would be a long stretch, right? But at the end of the day, it depends. It sort of also depends how a state interprets its obligation. We do declarations and reservations to treaties, and how we interpret these treaties, via our declarations or our reservations, what we say about these treaties. And we've interpreted some of the landmine, some of the Ottawa Convention provisions in certain ways, and in our ROE we've applied it very broadly, not even transporting the things around, right? Because we defined use as including transporting. I think in this case, it's on the facts. It's different enough to not put us in the frame legally, but certainly politically, right? That's a big thing. I know I think we use the Smart 155 rounds. Is that the German rounds? Because there's a whole lot of protections there, and I think the Ukrainians are using them as well. Again, the term use, how they're being used, and what impact they're having when they're used.
Right.
Well, if there's nothing else to round out there, I'll just get back on to. So this is really this captures what Willie and I wanted to follow up, Glenn, that I've sent you. And we'll bounce through each of these, and I would imagine there's going to be parts where we go down the rabbit hole, which is fine. So as we go through each one, I'll sort of, revise it a little bit, give the context, and then you can get right into it. All right. So the first one, this was more coming from me than from Matt. This one. The difference, the subtleties between an ID and a booby trap, and I've gone around the buoy in my own head several times about this, and how the Ottawa Treaty would view certain examples, and I've got some examples here. After the last one, I found a much better definition for me. So everyone has their own version of how they like to describe an ID. For me, this one, out of all the ones that I've ever looked at, makes the most sense, because you've got here any or all of the following: explosive ingredient, initiation, triggering, or detonation mechanism, or delivery system. So it's very broad. It's very all-encompassing because it gets super gray between what is a slightly tweaked conventional ordnance. You know, I've bent the hand grenade pin slightly. Have you modified it? You know, it's super gray. That might not be the best example, but so this is how I've been thinking about it of late, having some discussions with guys over there, because there's a lot of IED. There really are IEDs as nouns, as things, right?
Mm.
And by that, I mean an IED was built, or however it was assembled, and it was emplaced or dropped or deployed or driven or flown or whatever it was, got to its target and it did its job, right? And under the definition, it's got to have an explosive, it's got to have an initiator, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the noun, that's the thing, versus booby trap as a verb, as a doing thing. So I can booby trap something and I don't have to use explosive, right? So the very well-worn example from Vietnam are the punji stakes in the ground. That is a booby trap designed to catch a booby. There's no explosive, there's no initiator, there's no battery, there's nothing. Here is an example where they've taken a couple of hand grenades. This is in Ukraine. I'm pretty sure, well, I don't 100% know, but I think the Russians left this for the Ukrainians. So they've booby trapped a beehive. And how it's supposed to work is you take the lid off and it pulls the pins out of the grenades and the levers fly off and they blow up. And over time, the bees made enough honey that the honey went in and glued the pins in place. So when they pulled the lid off, it didn't function. Now, it doesn't have to be grenades. It could be anything. The act of booby trapping is quite broad. It basically says to me, you're relying on a form of victim operation, as opposed to the IED, which has got to have certain things to be an IED. So that's kind of how I think about it. Now, if you look at the IMAS standards or, you know, whatever NATO definition of booby trap IED, probably not going to align with that. But for me, that makes a lot of sense. So to recap on the anti-personnel landmine convention, no one, if you've signed up, you can't under any circumstances use anti-pers mines. What is an anti-pers mine? It's something designed to be exploded by the presence, proximity, or contact of a person, i.e. the victim, and it will incapacitate, injure, or kill one or more persons. And it can be fitted with, so it's got a mine has got to be placed on or near the ground or other surface area, which makes a lot of sense because that's where all the combatants are. Exploded in the presence or proximity of a person or vehicle. Anti-handle devices are usually inextricably linked to the mine. So they're there to protect the mine from being removed, extracted, tilted, pulled, whatever you want to do to it to get it out of the ground or out of its position. And an anti-handle device is there to stop the opposition sappers from affecting your emplaced mine, anti-personnel mine, or anti-tank mine. So for me, there is it gets grayer every time I think about it. There is a weird area between an anti-personnel landmine, an IED, and the act of booby trapping. So the actual booby trap part might have no explosive in it, but the act that it results in may have an explosive consequence. And we're seeing lots of things in the conflict on both sides where Willie and I really wanted to get your point of view on it. This is a very recent example from this month. This is an old case. This was first seen, I think, in former Yugoslavia. But the technique's been around forever and a day. You booby trap something attractive on the battlefield. In this case, we've got some plastic explosive placed in the bottom of a assault rifle magazine. They reassemble the magazine with the other IED components, that being a battery and a detonator. The switch you can see is made by a couple of contacts. Now, I'm not 100% sure how this one was found and what they've done to it, but it does appear to be that you find the magazine, the more rounds you push into the magazine, the more you compress the spring until the point where the two contacts touch, as in the bare wires there that are insulated from the coil touch. maybe. Someone else has said that this is actually designed to function as all the rounds are fired. It reaches a point where there's an internal contact that connects this part with the coil. So it's just not enough information to tell, but the idea is you leave it for your enemy. They pick it up thinking that it's a magazine with rounds. They either reload it or they use it and it blows up and kills them or severely injures them. So that, in my mind, is definitely an IED. But the act of leaving it for your enemy is a form of booby trapping battlefield, shiny things that you want someone to pick up and use.
And it's also at that point indiscriminate. So if
anyone could pick that up.
But I guess then there's I guess in a long bow, is it indiscriminate? If you're putting rounds into it, well, then you're at least targeting soldiers, but you're not targeting it aside. But if you're unloading it or something, it can just be a kid, it could be a tractor driving over it, whatever, what goes back into the indiscriminate nature that is not allowed in warfare, and then the Ottawa Treaty against what's mine, IED booby trap.
Absolutely. And this is the other example that we spoke about last time, Willie, which again could be anyone. So the TTP that was observed is that when you're trying to recover an enemy's deployed MON 50, so any personnel command initiated device, you go and you manually remove the detonator. And you can see in this example, when you remove the detonator, the two contacts on either side of the peg switch, and the old peg switch that's been around for many, many decades, closes that circuit and the power is applied to the detonator and the mine functions. So that is a victim-operated booby trapping technique. So yes, that is an IED, and it is a method to catch a victim indiscriminately. So to hand over the discussion to Glenn, how do you see all that, mate? What are the factors?
You blokes, this is such a good question on so many levels. I have to say, this is it's a 1.5 line question, which is really punchy. And I'm going to touch on something first, and I'm going to answer the question. And more stuff, there's rabbit holes, like I said, rabbit holes come out of it. But the first part is that the international community has recognized that some of these things that have been blanket banned, like landmines and cluster munitions, actually do have military benefit. Hence, a lot of states don't enter into these conventions, these treaties, right? So the international community has said, well, we recognize that. So rather than just saying banned and then hope states will get on board, we will actually regulate these particular weapon systems, etc. So that, because we know that people are going to use them, not entering into the treaty, they're using them, right? So let's regulate them, and let's invite people to enter into those treaties to help us regulate their use. This goes to the cluster munitions. I was reading a piece in somewhere just recently by an American military legal academic who's a former, a warfighter officer. It was very switched on. He was saying how cluster munitions must be given to Ukraine. Blah, blah. He was sprouting the benefits of the weapon from a tactical perspective, and then he was talking about the law. So the military benefits there, and so why not regulate the use of them? So that's the starting point here, which is what the international community has done. I'm gonna have to shuffle paper here because this is a bouncing ball in this process. That's why lawyers get paid so much, right? Because we just shuffle paper and make it look like we're really, working hard.
Someone's got to pay for the Range Rovers, mate, and the
yeah, I wish, right? I got my Ford Ranger out of 2 months worth of repairs the other day. So
it is a Ford Ranger, mate. You had the option of a Toyota. You had the option.
They were sold out at Hiluxes and Land Cruisers because of the conflicts around the world, I think.
That's right. I know, right? Anyway.
That's when we know it's going to shit. Hiluxes are in the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, that's right. Okay, so let's follow the bouncing ball. Ottawa Convention is the ban, it's the prohibition on anti-personnel mines, right? So that's the starting point. There's a thing called Protocol 2 to the Certain Conventional Weapons Convention. So the most recent amendment was in 1996. So it's Protocol 2 of 1980, amended in 1996. It doesn't prohibit the use of mines, booby traps, and other devices, but it regulates their use. And a lot of states have entered into this. Russia and Ukraine have, US, it's got a lot of pickups. So states that didn't enter into cluster munitions or Ottawa have entered into this protocol. And this is a pretty sensible. These international lawyers occasionally do something clever, and this is one of those times, I think, right? And it then defines mine in exactly the same way as the Ottawa Convention, and you touched on it a minute ago, right? But it then goes on to define booby trap and other device. Right, so this is where it now distinguishes. Previously, there was no distinction, and this is where the issue was. Like, this thing's been modified. What is it? We call it an IED, but legally, what is it? Like, where's the demarcation? So they've actually done that in this protocol. Booby trap. I'll just go through the key pieces, right? And then I'll send it to you later. You can put it up on a slide for your next, if you like, or something. Any device or material. So very broad interpretation starting point, right? Designed. So the key test here is it's designed. It's designed. What it's designed to be used for. Designed, constructed, or adapted. So this is where the IED thing comes into play a bit here. Like we adapt an old Soviet mortar to be an IED, whatever, right? To kill or injure, and which functions unexpectedly when a person disturbs or approaches, an apparently harmless object. So you look at it and you go, so we'll use our magazine, apparently harmless. There's no rifle attached to it, so it's apparently harmless, right? Or performs an apparently safe act. So the apparently safe act then it can be anything from, trying to remove it from the battle space or something that on its face doesn't appear to pose a risk. It's an issue of fact whether, and this is where you guys come into play, right? Weapons experts come into play. It's a question of fact whether the thing was designed to kill or injure. And lawyers will get we'll just be the puppet. We'll have someone like you, Coey, behind us making a mouths move to explain how that design of that weapon, in your expert opinion, because you'll be an expert witness, right? We qualify you as an expert, and then you give that evidence. We get the evidence out of you saying how it was designed, constructed, or adapted to kill or injure. That is the booby trap. That's quite a broad piece of definition there, but it also goes further to other devices. So it's really covered the field here. We've got mine here, and mine is mine. A mine is a mine. Also talks about remotely delivered mines, and we'll go into that after, and anti-personnel mines. It breaks it down. Other devices means manually emplaced munitions, right? Munitions and devices, including improvised explosive devices. So now it's even further defined IED. So it's drilling down now to cover all those other possible little scenarios where something's been bodged up to make an IED. Again, designed to kill, injure, or damage, and which are actuated manually, by remote control, or automatically after a lapse of time. So manual, remote control actuation, or automatically after a lapse of time. This is where this it's Article 2 of that protocol, subsection 5. This is what distinguishes IEDs from mines and booby traps that by that manual or timed actuation. Now, manually emplaced. This is where it's a bit of an interesting one. A large bomb with one of those delayed activation fuses that you guys are right across that I struggle to get my head around, even though I've got a shelf about weaponeering behind me, I still struggle, right? Because targeting weaponeering, you've got to be able to think weapons. A large bomb with a delayed action fuse mechanism could be another device, but it's the manual emplacement. So if you can't manually emplace it, then it falls outside that scope. So some pretty big bomb coming off a plane or something that, regardless of the delayed action fuse mechanisms, whatever, if it can't be manually in place, it doesn't fall into this definition. So
right, I'll just touch there, sorry, and say, like, in an infantry perspective, that is like firing an 84mm Carl Gustav to airburst at 400 meters is fine. But if you go lay out that same round and think, oh, I'm going to put it on a 30-second timer manually in place, or 10-minute timer, and walk away, that's where the law has or hasn't been broken, because you've manually placed that in position.
May not have broken it, because the next part of this protocol is the actual restrictions. So so what constitutes offences, right? So at the moment, they're saying that there's nothing illegal about them. You can use mines, booby traps, other devices, anything fitting those definitions. That's not illegal. It's how you use them, right? And that's where Article 3 of this this Protocol 2 starts saying how they're used. Because when we spoke about use before, use is the key term here. How they're used, which becomes dodgy. Now, I might just there's a whole bunch of them, and I'll go into them just in a bit of an overview. But the point about that magazine, that I think it's an AK magazine, whatever, that's a really good test case. That the fact that they've set it up as it would be an IED, manually placed, designed to kill, injure, or damage, actuated manually by remote control. Oh no, well, in fact, that would be a booby trap, because it's not. It's just it's when the person disturbs or approaches it, right? So I assume it wasn't actuated by a phone or anything. It wouldn't have been back then. It was just So it's a booby trap, right? Nothing illegal about that, but. And nothing illegal about it too. If it's laid out there for the intention being, so the intended use being for a soldier to pick it up, shiny thing, boom, not illegal. Provided again that all the other boxes are ticked, like it's the person is a combatant, the person isn't out of combat, isn't hors de combat, so isn't wounded or isn't in the process of surrendering or something. Like there's a whole bunch of other all the other little criteria, but on its face, prima facie, there's nothing illegal about that magazine. Leaving it laying around so that it can then be picked up by kids because it's a shiny thing, and it's just left laying around forever. That's when it starts to enter into this indiscriminate nature of the and it is a weapon, indiscriminate nature of the weapon, and the laying of that, the planting of that thing is an attack. It meets the definition of attack, right? It's a function being undertaken to target the enemy in offense or defense, right? So then, if it's left there with that intended purpose to target a soldier picking it up, but they walk away going, we don't care, they're being reckless as to what's likely to happen to it, then there's no more enemy soldiers around, the war's over, some kid picks it up, that's when it starts to become problematic. But on its face, that prima facie, that magazine is not in breach of any of these provisions. And unfortunately, I have to. A lot of this stuff too is. I spoke about customary law before, like it's treaty law and customary law. Treaty law applies to countries that enter into the treaty. Customary law applies to everybody. A lot of these restrictions on the use of these booby traps, mines, and other devices comes from the additional protocol to the Geneva Convention, so additional protocol 1, which is customary law. So these restrictions, and I'll go through a couple now, they apply to everyone, regardless of if they're a party to these treaties, right? So there's probably more questions in this, which you guys will probably ask me, which will lead me to this, but I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Like I say, such a good question, and so many little rabbit holes to this piece. Okay, the classic one. Oh, actually, also there's a technical annex in the back of this. It's a good protocol. It's a good bit of, as a prosecutor, it's a good bit of kit for me to be able to prosecute people who are inappropriately using IEDs, booby traps, etc. And I get my expert in, I get COE in, and I go through the technical annex, and I say, are these criteria in the technical annex met, or did they breach these criteria? Right. So there's a whole lot of stuff there that can make them illegal. Which again, it's good because it doesn't say don't use these things full stop, because militaries are going to use them, but it restricts how they're made and how they're used, and that makes a lot more sense. That's a I don't know. I think it's just it sounds a bit warmongery, but if they're going to use it anyway, why not restrict the use and give that humanitarian overlay by restricting the use? A couple of quick, I don't want to keep waffling, but here we go. So the classic one here is prohibited in all circumstances to direct weapons, etc., these weapons, right, against the civilian population or against individual civilians or civilian objects. So the old additional protocol 1 protection, you can't target civilians, right? So if you're laying it somewhere with the intention, so, to direct weapons. So you want to direct that weapon at the kids in the schoolyard. So you're laying it on that swing or something, knowing or even suspecting your intention is that it's for kids to pick up, you're in breach straight away. Right? But if you're laying it out there with the intention of one of these Australian, we love shiny things, right? One of these Australian soldiers is going to go, look at that shiny thing. Nothing wrong there. Again, unless it's designed like it's designed to cause superfluous injury. It's designed to somehow, like you just say, it's full of broken shards of glass and stuff, or something that is going to cause superfluous injury and suffering, which may not kill them, but it's going to, that then becomes problematic.
So if just as because this is going against just so much of like my own military career and what I was told.
Mm-hmm.
If an Australian soldier was to put a bomb in a magazine and lay it outside of our fob, and someone picks it up, so a counter soldier picks it up and it explodes in their face and kills them, every part of me says, well, Australia has signed and ratified these treaties. We cannot use person-initiated things like that, regardless of who we're targeting and the discriminate nature of it. That is a no-go. That's why we don't carry landmines. That's why, like you said before, that our Black Hawk helicopters could not have an American soldier in it with anti-purse mines. Isn't that because,
yes.
Because how can you ever say that this isn't just indiscriminate? Like, everyone has been in, somewhere in, whether it's Afghanistan or Avdiivka at the moment or Bakhmut, there's civilians still walking around. Like, I was in many areas where civilians would run out, plant their potatoes, run back in the bunker between the shelling. I don't think there's any use case. And many people have been in either, a harbored up somewhere, those who aren't militaries, like where you basically stop down for an extended period of time.
Yep.
And civilians walk straight through. Like, I just don't see how you could ever actually say that isn't. And like my sort of digger brain, soldier brain is saying just there's a no to all purse triggered weapons. So it's interesting to learn that may not be the case.
Well, no, it is. Trust your digger brain. Your digger brain's right.
Right.
We're not allowed. Remember last spoke about the weapons reviews. We're not allowed to introduce different weapons or modify weapons without weapon reviews. This sort of stuff would never pass the weapon review, right? So we have those systems in place that we can only use weapons that have passed our weapon reviews and have been signed off. And we can't. How you're told you can't modify. Like you do a bit of SOTG is a classic. They do little modifications to their personal weapon, but nothing. Nothing that's sort of beyond. It's all been nothing. There's nothing they can do that is going to have not been reviewed already.
Yeah.
Well, if they did, it would be picked up straight away. And the diggers. So your digger brain's correct. And the other point about when could the possible scenario arise where you could do this legitimately? That's going to come down to the facts on every occasion, right? And if there's like, and the magazine, this I said it's not illegal, but how many circumstances are there going to be where there's not going to be a risk of it targeting a civilian, in either intentional? It's not. We'll say it's not intentional. We'll say it's been laid, directed. So laid for the purpose of targeting a soldier, but there's that risk of targeting civilians, and they haven't cast their minds to that risk, or they've just chosen to ignore it. That's when it becomes problematic. Right. So, and that the magazine one's a hard one to overcome, but booby traps. Such as the hand grenade case, right, where they might rig this thing up on a doorway or something, knowing that there are soldiers, the enemy combatants, so a targetable enemy, about to go that way, and that there is not going to be any civilians going there. They've been through whatever warnings or what they've done. They know there's no civilians by whatever mechanism they've established that. They know it's going to be enemy combatants. And it's not going to cause superfluous, it'll kill them, but it's not going to cause superfluous injury, etc. Then there's no problem with that booby trap. But we go back through. We have to go through all of these little bits and pieces, and then, like I say, the traditional IHL applies. So that can't cause superfluous injury. There must be a military objective. So killing enemy soldiers is a military objective. Indiscriminate use is the next one. Indiscriminate, any placement of such weapons is indiscriminate if it's not targeted if it's not intentionally targeted, right? So that's where this magazine becomes problematic.
But like,
Yeah.
If okay, say I'm an Australian soldier fighting in a village somewhere. There's no civilians there, and I take one of my grenades off my F1 and I sit it at a door with the bail held closed by the doorway. And a combatant opens up and he initiates it and it blows up. Would an Australian, is that kosher? Like, because I haven't modified the system. Like, I don't think that would meet the term of modification. But my brain would say I'm not allowed to do that. Because otherwise, why would Australia not have landmines? Like, why would we not? Well, they've passed the US test and they've passed Russia's and China's and Ukraine's testing landmine. Let's just let's use them. They're cheap. They're well, you can argue the effectiveness, but they're cheap and useful in maybe some use case. I don't see then why the Ottawa Treaty is at all useful. And I know Adam probably preach to the choir here going, yeah, a lot of this isn't fucking useful because there's a way around it. But in that case, would have I as a soldier broken out like Australia's laws?
Your digger brain's right again, because that's not the way. How are you trained to use that grenade? You're trained to pull, spin, and throw, right?
Yeah.
And that's in doctrine. It's how you're trained. It's how you're signed off. The rules of engagement, not off, but the rules of engagement. You go into some detail, and you'll see that weapons are employed, use of force, blah blah blah, in the way that they're intended, and you're trained, etc. There's all these caveats. So this sort of stuff is not going to. We're not going to be booby trapping. We're not going to be using IEDs. We're going to, because we have our internal controls in place.
Yeah.
But this is to recognise that these things are going to be used.
Yeah.
Right. We have internal controls, and you're right. That grenade. That's not how we use grenades. We're a party to this protocol, but that doesn't mean we're going to be doing this stuff. It just means that we've signed up to it. The reality is, because of these restrictions in Article 3, because they're customary law and they all come from Additional Protocol 1, we're a party to it anyway.
Yeah. And
in fact, countries that Russia and Ukraine are a party to Protocol 2, but even if they weren't, they'd be a party to these restrictions on their use because of the fact that it's customary. It applies to everyone. It's in Protocol 1, and they're parties to Protocol 1 anyway. Right? So when you go through these, and the examples you're using are great, because that's exactly what you do when you're working your way through the little the little subsections of what lawyers do. You work through them, and you see that that it needs to be the method or means of delivery. So how it's in place or how it's used must be directed at a specific military objective. So again, this becomes a bit more problematic with that magazine. What specific military objective is that magazine aimed at? Right, the grenades tied to that door. Well, yeah, there's an enemy patrol coming. They have to go this way. Right, that's a specific military objective, right? So it turns on the facts, and you can always find examples, but it also, you can always find examples where it's not applicable. I'll just give you a couple more quick examples, I think. In case of doubt, when you're looking at whether it's directed against the military objective, in case of doubt, whether the thing the object you're targeting, or the thing you're targeting with this weapon is being used to make an effective contribution to military action. So in other words, that it's a military objective. In case of doubt, it isn't. So in case of doubt, it's not, the thing you're targeting is not making an effective contribution to military action. Right. So again, this all chips away at the use of that. I'm mixing the magazine because it's a great example. It's a great example, right? On its face, prima facie, nothing wrong with it. When you start chipping away at the use of it and how it's deployed, so how it's directed, it starts to become problematic. Does that make sense?
What then if a country, because you speak it like, well, my training of using a grenade was to, pull the pin, me throw it, bail comes off, explodes. But does the Ottawa Treaty, do they say, well, that's how grenades are used? Or if the Australian Army just starts teaching us, well, grenades are just fucking, you can put in a doorway, is then that circumvent the law? Like, do they also tell us on how these weapons are used? Because if we just change our teaching of how to use them officially, does that not just get around it? And if Russia or Ukraine say, oh yeah, well, we're teaching guys to use plastic explosive in a magazine like this, I don't see how there's not ways to circumvent around basically any of this law.
No, again, really good point. It's not Ottawa, it's the protocol too, but you're right.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
your protocol. That's why we have the technical annex, and we go to the technical annex here. I've flagged it because I flag everything. And it has all the specifications, right? All the specifications of this thing, these things, what you can and can't do to make them. All right. And there's things like all remotely delivered anti-personnel mines shall. And then there's a whole bunch of criteria there, right? But if you're outside those criteria, it's illegal. All non-remotely delivered anti-personnel mines shall, blah, blah, blah. What else? You have to have signs saying that, anti-handling devices. If you have anti-handling devices fitted to any of this stuff, you have to have signs around, and you have to have it recorded and available. So in other words, you have to put it in the telegraph, you put it in the telly and say, we've got these things here. This is all the specifications. Oh, they've got anti-handling devices. They're within this grid reference. You got to put that out there.
I don't think there's much battlefield recording of these devices or any mines being deployed. Hey, this is perfect. Now that you got that annex in front of you and you're talking through some of these, this is perfect for this next point. The little Johnny, which
can I make one point? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
On what Glenn said about, in that it says you have to have signed and gridded and whatever. I think people may go, oh, well, that's stupid. Why would you ever use landmines if you have to tell the enemy where it is or have public knowledge of where it is and also sign it? This is why landmines, from an infantry perspective, this is why they're effective. Landmines are not effective at having a soldier tread on it, blow their leg off. That is not why an infantryman like myself would see an effect in mines. The effect in mines is area denial. That we go, oh yeah, this 10 or this 100-acre area of forest, we've mined. We've put signs up. We're telling you we've mined all this shit. Therefore, it's area denial that the enemy now cannot move, or they wouldn't fucking want to. They would want to walk through or put their vehicle through or move through. It's area denial. And we can use multiple area denials to funnel the enemy into an area to then have a machine gun or ambush them. And the reason that these militaries like the Yanks or the Russians or Ukrainians like landmines and we're saying, like you said before, that they must have a military use because otherwise America wouldn't have them. Their military use isn't me as a other combatant stepping on it. Military use is, well, Willie as a section commander is never going to launch an operation through this field. So it's denied that area, and mines are incredibly cheap to make in huge quantities and very simple to make when you're comparing it to a bloody missile. So in time of war, we can just air deny this whole region, and therefore the enemy combatants have to use this. That's my personal why I see them coming into place. I think it's important to distinguish why.
A couple of aspects, technical aspects from an engineer point of view. There's different types of minefields, and there's certain laws around how to mark and record them. There's all this procedure, there's all this process, etc. An area that's marked as a minefield and contains no minefields is a dummy minefield.
Yeah,
right. That has
effective.
Yeah. Until you start to breach that minefield and nothing goes boom, then you're like, well, this is either a very high dud rate or it's a dummy minefield. It's complete opposite in Ukraine, Russia now. That in the territories there, it's like the meme that came out when COVID was at its peak, and the meme was, it was a public safety alert, the one that New South Wales puts out, and it gives you the areas of hotspots, and it said COVID hotspots areas everywhere. Just assume it's everywhere. And that was the thing. I think with these minefields, not only do people not have enough time to mark and record them, but literally the entire eastern part of the Ukraine is a minefield. Yeah. And nobody has any record. Nobody has any time. It's just a massive unexploded ordnance hazard, will be for decades to come. But absolutely, you can do minefields where there's one mine. And if it explodes, if a single mine explodes and you're a breaching force, you have to assume you're in a minefield, even though it might be a nuisance minefield. Or if nothing explodes, it might be a dummy minefield. So there's lots of elements there to how the mines are employed, but you're absolutely right. It could be I mean, in the heavy fighting areas, the mines are getting used to kill or destroy vehicles. They don't care about the psychological effect. They're just mass treating the area with mines in the hope that you just prevent anybody getting through. And even if they start to get through, you hit them with artillery or drones or whatever. But you're absolutely right. Marking an area and declaring that as a minefield, whether or not there's 0, 1, or 1,000,000 mines in it, that's going to be a cause for pause to figure out, hey, is it going to be worth losing a tank, losing a whatever? And minefields traditionally are always covered by observation and fire. So you've got to consider, what are you going to do if you are in fact going to go through the minefield and not around it? Sorry, Glenn, you were going to.
So you blokes, I was going to set you an exam for after this, but you've just passed in the last couple of questions and responses. This protocol 2, catered to exactly what you're saying. And if you go into the Travo is like the debate on the passage, how we debate bills in Parliament. The Travo is the way that the people contribute to the passage of this legislation, essentially. Travo talks about dummy minefields, and it goes, well, yes, but they're not going to want to be marking everything. Because that tactically, but then they said, well, no, because it uses the word dummy minefields on a number of occasions. It says you can use them. That's a tactical initiative. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not perfidy. It's not blah, blah, blah. You're still going to tie up. You're still going to deny them that area for a certain amount of time. It's still an area denial mechanism. So it's aimed at IHL to protect non-combatants at the end of the day, right? So to protect the civilians, etc., so that we don't get this situation which we know we have in Ukraine, landmines everywhere and elsewhere around the world, is to start to grip that sort of stuff up, right? So people can then tactically use dummy. So you comply with this, you sign them, you do whatever, blah blah blah, and you have not everything's going to be on the sign. You're not going to have all the tech data on that sign, like including anti-handling devices. All that stuff is held elsewhere, right? But it's there and it's available, and it's available for another reason for demining activities. So when the area is demined and they know where the stuff is, what component, what sort of ordnance it is, AHDs, whatever else, right? So there's it ticks a whole lot of the IHL boxes without totally denying the military the tactical benefit of using this kit. So I think it's a bit of a tick in the box for international humanitarian law. To be honest, it recognises that we still have a military objective to achieve. War's not going away. But we can layer protections on top of that, on top of the use of these weapons.
Did you we'll use this next one then as a case study for what you've just been talking about, because this is where the discussion got last time with Willie and I. The little Johnny, which you may or may not have seen, I'm pretty sure you mentioned you saw that in the video. So this is a specific device. And I'll be really interested to hear what you have to say about what's in the annexes there and how it describes it. This is a pretty sophisticated, compact little device, and it was used again the other day. The original configurations that I saw were very effective. The Russians put out a public safety video about it because it was so effective. This one is it has certain arming times in self-destruct. This is a 3-minute arm, 10-minute, 10 is it day or hour? I can't remember. Different configurations. I saw one the other day was a 1-minute arm time, 20-minute self-destruct. So there's obviously a wide variety of how they're configured, but they're very, very clever. Accelerometers, magnetometers, and self-destruct. Now that's a really key one for me. If these things are getting hand emplaced, 9 out of 10 times they're camouflaged in grass or it's snowing there now, or sorry, winter there now, so white camouflage. But I've seen all sorts, camouflage pattern uniform, the trouser leg, wrapped in a trouser leg, etc. Dropped by a drone, chucked out of the side of a vehicle as they drive past. Most of the time, they've been put on roadways to target vehicles. And now, microcontroller components are usually pumped out thousands at a time. Usually places like China, consumer electronics can have a high failure rate. But I would argue, having played with things like Arduino, Raspberry Pi a lot, the likelihood of having a failure rate for self-destruct in the teens of percentages, so over 10%, would be pretty low. I would say that these would be, the self-destruct feature built into these would be pretty effective. So in terms of, are they effective at targeting vehicles using known routes or choke points, can be delivered very quickly. They're safe to handle and employ because they've got a safe to arm time. They've got several cheap, small sensors that will pick up the either wheeled vehicle, tank, soldier, in-body armor, and rifle, or hidden in an innocuous, shiny thing like the walkie-talkie there on the right. I was concerned that they are employing something that really looks like an anti-personnel landmine in breach of the Ottawa Treaty. But by what you've just described, this sounds like an innovative battlefield tool, explosive tool, that they are using for specific objectives.
Yeah. Mate, I think the latter is correct. I've read the Human Rights Watch did a report on the little Johnnies, and I think PFM, they call them PFM mines.
PTM3.
Yeah, PTM3. There we go. Yeah. This is where the first thing is you go to those definitions, right? Now, if they do meet the definition of and Human Rights Watch says Ukraine's in breach because they breached their obligations under under Ottawa, right? But they haven't gone into any analysis of the tech data. They haven't gone into what this thing is, right? They're just saying it's a mine, they're in breach. But then if we have a look at these definitions, and from my reading of the Human Rights Watch report, I think it meets. So these things are mostly my dogs. These things are mostly they're not manually in place. They're mostly like air launched, or artillery? Is that the
drone delivered? Drone
delivered. That's right. Drone delivered. Here we go. Okay. Just having a look here.
But can also be hand emplaced.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, let's have a look. We should look at mine first, right? And have a look at munition placed under, on, or near the ground or other surface, designed to be exploded by the presence, proximity, or contact of a person or vehicle. So that's quite a broad definition. Designed to be exploded by presence, proximity, or contact. So I guess they are, aren't they? It's like picking them up essentially. Like they're not remotely detonated or anything, are they? They're just
no, they're triggering by a magnetic signature from a vehicle.
Okay.
They can also be fitted with light sensitive switches if you open the lid of them.
Yeah.
And the PTM3 is a scatterable mine that's had the original manufactured fusing removed, and it's had the little Johnny microcontroller with surefire battery attached, or the little Johnny with detonator is put in an innocuous item.
Okay, well, let's go to the next one. And we move past mine. We'll go to remotely delivered mine. It's a mine not directly in place, but delivered by artillery, missile, rocket, mortar, or similar means, or dropped from an aircraft. Okay, so drop from the drones, right? So we have to look at the mine definition first, and it's a mine which is delivered by those means. So at the moment, it's still a mine. It still meets the mine definition per Ottawa. So at the moment, we're still bound by Ottawa, by the landmine ban, which applies to Ukraine, but not to Russia. Just trying to see whether it fits any of the. Look, I think based on those definitions, I think Ukraine is stuck with what Human Rights Watch have said. My reading is that at the moment they are mines per Ottawa, and they're bound by the Ottawa. Now, Human Rights Watch did hit up Ukraine, and they said, well, please explain. And Ukraine said, well, we're not going to tell you what we're in the course of this war. We're not going to tell you what we're doing with our weapons, but we do comply with our obligations under the treaties. That's what Ukraine's response was. That came from what's his name? I'll just tell you. I think I met him actually last time I was in town. Just bear with me for a second. Alexander Polishchuk, who is the Deputy Defence Minister, right? He came out and said Ukraine's a reliable member of the international community. It commits to all our obligations on mine usage. This includes the non-use of anti-personnel mines. During the war, we strictly adhere to the standards of IHL. Blah blah blah. But we cannot comment on the types of weapons used during the armed conflict before the end of the war and the restoration of our sovereignty and territorial integrity. So the upshot is Human Rights Watch has done that little process that we just did, and they've interpreted these things to be mines per the Ottawa Convention, which is the same as the mine definition in Protocol 2, and they've said you're in breach. And Ukraine has said we comply with everything, but we're not going to talk to you about it until after the war.
Yeah, it sounds like bullshit, just like him saying they're not using anti-personnel mines. Like,
no, you're right.
In that quote, he said they're not using AP mines, which, like, do we? And my issue on this stuff is that because the West, who's completely overwhelmingly the control of the UN, the ICC, ICJ, because we have said we are pro-Ukraine, we just turn a blind eye to all of this. Like, if anyone can take that quote seriously and say Ukraine is not using AP mines, then they are absolutely talking out their ass. Like at what point does anyone step in and go, Human Rights Watch is likely correct about this? Okay, this is a weapon system of you don't want to divulge what it's using. Well, who's investigating this? Or are we just going, oh, that's all right, because we don't want to give away your secrets. I get it if you're talking about using a fucking SR-71 back in the 80s. We don't want to divulge these secrets. Okay, but in small technology with countries you trust under investigation, and obviously talking out your ass saying you're not using AP mines, how has someone not stepped in and gone, hey, we are investigating this? Because as you know, with AP mines, Ukraine was given funding from the US and from other nations to destroy their anti-personnel mines, which ended. The money was never spent to do. And now Ukraine has laid hundreds of thousands to millions of mines across their country and saying, well, because of Russia, it doesn't, to me, it's just none of this is fitting the bill, and no one is actually ever going to prosecute and pull this up.
I think the question spoke about how, like, what mechanisms, I think that's going back to the question, what mechanisms are available to address that. Is that what it was? Something about the, let me have a look here.
Just ramifications for a breach.
Yeah. Well, because this is a convention, and it's not like a criminal code like the Rome Statute is. The convention, the mechanisms are that they're taken, that because it's a multilateral treaty, that a state takes Ukraine to the ICJ essentially and says, oh yeah, look at whatever mechanism is in there to address breaches, right? And it often ends up in the ICJ, but this may not. But for a state to say, Ukraine, you've breached your obligations under the convention because of this, this, and this. Now, probably not going to happen. Russia well may, but so what? They're not a party to it, so they can't. You know what I mean? They might ask another state party to do it on their behalf. Well, that's really no one who's going to do it. Belarus isn't a party either, as far as I know. But regardless, so there's no criminal mechanism. But then the criminal mechanism comes into use, and this is where we have to look at the Rome Statute. And this is where we start looking at all of those, and I'll just find the actual provision.
But are we not holding up our own? Like, at the end of the day, okay, no party's going to take Ukraine to it because the countries that have signed on have said that we are on Ukraine's side. But it's at the same time, it's like, well, but aren't we responsible for holding our own members and parties that we're friendly with to the same standard of which would hold ourselves? Isn't that, like, if I'm friends with someone who's done something wrong, just because I'm friendly with you doesn't mean that I shouldn't be saying, hey, this is not correct. I think that's where a lot of people's problem with this is if Ukraine just made a dirty bomb and blew it up, is anyone going to actually say anything? Now, that may have a criminal offense, but I think where Russia would say is similar to damming water down into Crimea, that when they take it to these, that it's then thrown out and not really looked at. That I don't see the point of having these in place if other countries won't even hold anyone responsible for themselves.
That's a really good point, Matt. The next three questions, the questions 3, 4, and 5, will weave that theme, what you just said, through all of them, because that's the same case. Is anything going to happen? There's obviously a lot of evidence. Some is clearer than, stronger than others, but that it's the the next one's the drone, the riot control agents, and the release of chemicals. It's the same situation with slightly different context and parameters.
Yeah. Like, Glenn, am I correct in saying that under whatever Ukraine has signed, they should not be using anti-personnel mines? Is that correct?
That's correct. That's under this convention. Right now, the mechanism that most of these treaties have their own internal mechanism to resolve disputes. And then if it goes beyond that, often the ICJ can step in, but that would never go to that stage. There is an internal dispute mechanism here, and it's quite gently, really. I can sort of understand why. When states parties agreed to enter into this, I suspect a lot of people were going, hang on, we use these mines, they're a tactical bit of kit, right? This is important. So the states parties shall consult and cooperate with each other to settle any dispute. All right, so consult and cooperate. The meeting of those states parties may contribute to the settlement of the dispute by whatever means it deems appropriate, blah, blah, blah. The article, so this section, Article 10, is without prejudice to the provisions of the Convention on clarification of compliance. So in other words, it's saying that the internal dispute resolution mechanism for non-compliance is that we'll consult and cooperate and try and help the other side to comply. So it's very light on. Right now, I think if anyone, like Ukraine's come out and said, no, we're not doing it, that's fine. I've been there. There's mines everywhere. And as we know, everyone knows that, right? Yeah. I think states may have said you're using anti-personnel mines, you shouldn't be, but at the same time, as you said, with Russia as the aggressor laying mines everywhere, Ukraine needing something to push back, particularly the advance on Kyiv, I think that the states would accept the response of the Deputy Defence Minister when he said, we're not going to talk about our weapons until after we've protected our territorial sovereignty, right? So there's a lot of politics. There's a lot of politics at play here.
Yeah.
And the internal dispute mechanism itself isn't very overly powerful. So, and most of them aren't, to be honest, because it's diplomacy at play. Diplomacy meshed with law. I just don't think anyone is going to take it beyond. And then what are they going to do too? Like, let's just say okay, Ukraine, you're using anti-personnel mines. We're a states party to this convention as well. So we're saying to you, you're using anti-personnel mines. You're a states party. You shouldn't be. We'd like to encourage you not to. And they'd say, well, what can we do instead? We'd say, well, that's not our problem. But if you don't comply, we're not going to give you any taipans. Well, sorry, but they're being buried anyway, right? And what else are we giving them? Like, you know what I mean? The stick and carrot. We have no stick and we have no carrot.
Yeah, but but in a case of this on political level, does that just mean all these are useless? They're worthless, because why bother having them if we're not going to hold ourselves or another country of which we're friendly with to the standard? Why is the other countries where people say the rise of the global south? I could agree with them going, well, you don't even hold yourself to the standard. You can all get fucked. I completely get that attitude where people will go, well, then I don't feel bad about Russia bombing this or bombing this. Because, well, you guys are obviously not holding yourself or a country that you're friendly to that standard. I think that the wearing away at these and the politicization of it just makes them worthless. And yeah, I think, I'm not saying that we then don't fund Ukraine, but we go, hey, look, we even funded you to get rid of these AP mines. You've signed, and the thing to do is you don't sign that treaty. You don't sign the treaty like Russia's done. Russia's gone, no, we're going to use them. America said we're going to use them. So we haven't signed the treaty. I'm not saying Ukraine shouldn't use them, but I think that as on a world scale, if we want to maintain any serious, like if we want our word to be worth anything, we need to hold ourselves to it as well. And that's what people around the world are saying is, well, none of this isn't worth, we're not even going to take your word anymore because it's not worth anything. I know that's getting beyond this conversation. It's political, but I think if the law is not going to hold those who have broken it responsible, regardless of how you feel about it, well, then why bother having it in the first place? And it's not worth having.
There's another little line. I hear what you're saying. It's another little line to this too, is that Ukraine's prohibited from using stockpiling, etc. All those little verbs in there. The anti-personnel mines, but there's no. They can use anti-vehicle mines. Now, undoubtedly, they're going to say that they're using anti-vehicle mines in a lot of these locations. Now, again, that would require, technical expertise to come in and say, well, we know you're not on these bases, blah, blah, blah. I'm just having a look, sorry, at, but what you're saying is right. What you're saying is quite right. They are, and if anyone can say we have evidence using anti-personnel mines, and I'm sure there's an abundance of it out there. They haven't come back. They did say, in fact, as you said, Deputy Minister, we're not using anti-personnel mines. He said it in there.
Yeah.
Right. So but they're allowed to use anti-vehicle mines, as we know. Mind you, too, as I guess Coe could answer this, but one of the travaux to the protocols I was reading overnight, in fact, is they were saying that there's a big, there's no longer that big distinction between anti-personnel mines and anti-vehicle mines now. The two creatures have become a lot more similar. So it's harder to distinguish between the two. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Coe, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd say as someone looking in, which is at the end of the day, the law has to reflect, your dumb soldier on the ground, that's who you're protecting at the end of the day. People get in their bloody wigs and bloody coats, but at the end of the day, you're protecting dudes like me on the front line. That, well, I can see an anti-tank mine. I understand that is to take out a tank or a vehicle. And in some of them, depending on it can have a car drive over it and be fine. Where Ukraine or Russia have these munitions from multi-launch rocket systems that are horrifically inaccurate, with 1,000+ petal mines that are meant to be disguised like a leaf in them, firing them all over the battlefield no matter where. I don't think anyone in their right mind can say, one, that's not a mine, or that we're not using mines, and secondly, that is to take out a vehicle, because it may pop a tire on a forward drive. It's going to do nothing to a serious military vehicle like armored. It might take out a Bushmaster tire. Much more than that, no. That I think, there may be a grey zone now of what is AT and what is AP, and that might be difficult. But I think if you want clear evidence of anti-purse being used, well, what would disguising an anti-tank mine or an anti-vehicle mine like a leaf that is tiny in the size, what would that actually do? And why would you then have it basically with no metal in it so you can't bloody mine lab it? So I get it. Yeah, I think it's just a hard one. Me learning this from you, and this is a learning curve for me, is just seeing this degradation of our system that is not willing to self-police.
Let's open the next can of worms, because I bet you.
I'll quickly touch on that one just quickly. Sorry,
yeah.
Wrap it up, Coe. Willie, Human Rights Watch pretty much said verbatim what you just said, and they even used the term petal mines. So, mate, they think you're on the money. And now that I've had a look and gone through the definitions, I think you're on the money. Right. So we've just put Ukraine in the frame in this podcast. so we're doing a good job, right?
And we should note too that Russia is doing this to a horrific level as well. No one's denying that, but the difference is Russia hasn't signed these treaties, nor has the US, and Ukraine probably shouldn't have if they wanted to continue using this, of which they have.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Well, let's slide sideways, because this is probably going to have a similar theme depending on the aspects that Glenn talks to. But this came up, drones are everywhere on that battle space. Kamikaze dropped, or for the delivery of ammunition or food or for reconnaissance. One that I saw the other day, one that I saw this morning was a jet-powered version that so there's all this data that got hacked by Anonymous and leaked to do with Russian drones, a lot of it being produced or supplied by Iran. And one of the models was a jet-powered reconnaissance drone that did 600 kilometers an hour. So there's everything from that end to, modified quadcopter, very cheap thing. And the biggest thing, there's lots of stuff we could talk about here, but given we're already at 2 hours something, probably the most important thing here, I think, is that came up for Willie and I last time, is using a drone delivered either dropped or kamikaze style effect, whether it's kinetic terminal or kinetic explosive or whatever, on someone that's clearly not a combatant. They're shell shocked. They're injured, they're unconscious, they're being stretchered, whatever it is. The legalities on that under the Geneva Convention, again, this is something, I'm not on either side. I've seen both sides do this. It's total war, you know, that no one is off limits. Anyone that's in that conflict area, doesn't matter what you're doing. If you are suspected of being on the opposing side, you're getting targeted with a drone. If I've got one to target you with. So that's sort of where we can start this one. And here's some of the examples. Glenn, I think you've already seen these. We talked about these, and Willie, you and I spoke to death about all the different drone stuff. So what's probably most useful to thrash out using are these two video examples. And I've shown you both the full length version of these two videos. What I'll show now is an edited version of each that doesn't show the graphic content, given where this video is going to be shown. So the video on the left here is the aftermath of an armored assault. Appears to be the Russian side, where hasn't gone well. The reconnaissance drone is looking at what is clearly an injured guy. You know, he's laying around. He's got no weapon. He's clearly combat ineffective. And what happens is this reconnaissance drone is filming, and a drone delivered piece of ordnance that you can see there, front and or top left-ish of the screen, gets dropped right next to his head and kills the guy instantly.
I think too, it's worth noting that he is, in my eyes, attempting to put up his hands as if surrendering.
Yeah. Yep.
I think it would be hard not to say that he wasn't.
Second video here is a kamikaze-style drone targeting a group of there's 4 Russians carrying what you would assume is either I would assume is an injured person.
A casualty.
It could be someone that's deceased. It could be equipment, maybe, but I would think it's someone's injured.
And then this will say that it is a wounded soldier. Yeah.
Yep. And in the video, the kamikaze just flies straight into them, targets the whole lot. So the drone targets center of scene mass of that group of dudes. And that's where I'll segue over to you guys to discuss the Geneva Convention's aspects and the laws of armed conflict, rules of engagement, that kind of thing.
So the things because I speak about this publicly, Glenn, a lot about scenarios exactly like probably the one on the left, where the guy is on the ground attempting to surrender, you know, waving at the drone. He's injured. He can't move. He can't defend himself. He's currently unarmed.
Yep.
And I speak about this publicly a lot, and I like to read the public's, their response to this. And as a soldier, I see this no differently to someone being wounded and you walking up and shooting them. Execution style, that is completely out of the rule book. That is, you cannot do that. But I have a lot of people too in my audience who are going, well, firstly, warfare like this with drones on this level is a fairly new thing. Yes, we've seen it in other warfares, but it's also fairly new. That if there's no reasonable way of taking him POW or giving aid, how does that then change the scenario? Because if this is in no man's land, middle of nowhere, you can't reasonably take this person as a prisoner, that he can't actually surrender. Can he surrender to a drone? Now, I think that is a cop-out. I think it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter that it still is hands up, unarmed. At that point, you can't target it. But that is what a large part of the audience is saying, is if there's no reasonable way to actually to have him surrender, therefore, it is, allowed, which is brutal. But I don't agree with that side either.
Yep. You're right. This is it's a brave new world, but it's a brave new world that we're seeing en masse in Ukraine and elsewhere, right? So law is slow to keep up, but in this case, it's had to pull its finger out and try and keep up. And these are classic point. These are perfect examples. We started fundamental IHL first, right? So fundamental LOAC. We'll go back to first principles. First principle is that, and we'll say that you're right, he's surrendering, right? But even if he wasn't, if he was wounded, either way, he's hors de combat, he's out of combat. And you can't target somebody who's out of combat. The hors de combat wounded soldier goes back a long way pre any contemplation of drones putting things on people, right? So that was the soldier coming up going, wounded guy, don't kill him, take him away and treat him, right? Drone's not going to take him away and treat him. So let's just put that aside for the moment, the fact that he's wounded, even though I say that the obligation is still there not to blow him up. But the surrendering bit is the more powerful piece here, I think. Ukraine has a program called Will to Live, I think, or something.
I want to live, maybe?
I want to live. And they put this stuff out to, it's a PSYOP thing, put it out to all the Ruskies and said, if you surrender, our drones will guide you into a certain location and blah, blah, blah. And there'll be Ukrainian soldiers there to meet you. All well and good. I want to live. Yeah, that's what it's called. All well and good. The point about whether you can surrender to a drone, the US have said that that any surrender, they've said this all along before even the drone space, right? There must be a clear expression from the US doctrine. There must be a clear expression of the intention to surrender, and that reflects what's in the additional protocol. So the Geneva Convention protocols, where it says that you can't make a person who clearly expresses an intention to surrender the object of attack. So just going back to the fundamentals, right? Was there a clear expression for him to surrender? I think so. He was wounded anyway, right? He's out of the fight. So by doing this stuff, he knew the drone was there. Clearly, he's looking up at it. Well, I think he's looking up at it, but he's certainly gesturing to something, right? I think that's a pretty clear expression of an intention to surrender. So on Article 41 of the protocol, so pre-drone, this law is still good law. Was he the object of attack? Absolutely, right? The other point, and you raised this quite correctly, is could he actually physically, like, can you surrender to a drone? The feasibility of surrendering to a drone. If he wasn't wounded, if he was just there, put his weapon down and said, I surrender, well, really what? So what? The drone can't take him in. Like, the drone can't take the weapon off him, search him and march him in. So is that a feasible, even though he's clearly expressed an intention to surrender, is that feasible that he can surrender and be taken into captivity? The fact that Ukraine, this is where I think it goes the way I think you're going, Willie, is the fact that Ukraine have these protocols in place where they say, tell the Russians, follow the drone or do this or do that, and it will, then the Ukrainians will meet you there. They've put protocols in place to enable surrendering to drones. So they're clearly contemplating surrendering to drones, which means, the other side of the coin is that they're clearly contemplating not making somebody who's surrendering to a drone an object of attack. So on that imagery, not just the wounded thing just aggravates it, I think, but I think they've breached the fact that they've implemented this process tells me that they think that Ukraine thinks you can, or Ukraine knows you can surrender to a drone. Therefore, that little logistical problem is no longer relevant. And I think they've breached the protocol rule against making a surrendering person object of attack. Yeah. I think it's pretty clear on that one, to be honest.
I mean, if the person's surrendering, you can't take them physically into captivity, but they're surrendering. The default action is not lethal force. The default action should be, what are my other options? And just because you can't physically take them into captivity doesn't mean, oh, well, I tried the thing that I'm supposed to try. I guess there's nothing else but to kill him. That just doesn't, that doesn't hold any weight at all.
And this is not, let's not act like this is few and far between. No. There's 100 new videos every single day of this happening. And look, people are going to hate me for saying this. I see more videos of this happening towards Russian soldiers than I do towards Ukrainian soldiers. Now, that figure, and that is what I see online, and I can't back that up. Now, the reason probably for that is there's far higher casualty rates on the Russian side, and we're seeing better use of this warfare. But, it's at minimum a 50-50 split, and people are completely marching this on like it's a good thing. No, this person, the way I see it, is no different. Like that scenario is no different to if I'm on the ground with my section, we take a prisoner, the helicopter rocks up and says, Willie, we can't take you plus prisoner, and he's wounded. I can't then shoot him and get on the helicopter with my guys and leave. I then am going, well, look, this sucks. Okay, mate, you're behind. And also, a surrendering prisoner like that, you have to be awarded medical care if it's reasonable. And you look, I'm not saying this scenario is reasonable. It's probably in the middle of bloody no man's land. But you sure as hell can't do what you've done there. If you have got 2 trench systems and someone runs in between and surrenders, you can't then go, we can't come and get you, so we're going to shoot you. But there's nothing being done about it. If anything, it's published by official accounts as propaganda, which is a question for another time about the legalities of doing this. But yeah, it's a horrible thing that no one is taking any accountability for, and no one is holding either Russia or Ukraine account for this.
I'll just build on that. To what you both said is well, to my mind, it's on the money, firstly, but it's supported by the fact that Ukraine itself has put protocols in place to enable this surrender by drone, as I say, to enable this in good faith surrender by drone. So it'd be a bit grayer had they not done that, but the fact they've done that makes it a lot more black and white. And just the accountability piece, the international protocol 1, the IHL says you will not target people who have clearly expressed an intention to surrender. If you do that, then the criminality arises in the Rome Statute, and there are crimes in the Rome Statute which cover exactly that. I won't go to them now unless you want me to, but and Ukraine, as we know, is not a party to the Rome Statute, but it's agreed to be bound by it. So it's, for all intents and purposes, it's covered. If those offences are found to be proven, then that they're in breach of the, they can be held accountable by the Rome Statute. And that goes to
by someone would have to hold them account to it. Well,
that's right. And it should be Ukraine. It should be Ukraine because they get the principle of complementarity. They get first bite of the cherry, right? They should be going. And if the drone, I'm assuming the drone pilot has control over the release of the weaponry. That's an assumption I'm making, and that's based on my limited experience, right? So they're in the frame. They're accountable immediately because they've made a decision to target that. Somebody's possibly directing that. There's a chain of there's accessorial liability here, and there's probably also command responsibility here. Well, there would be for the commanders not making sure that their people weren't doing this, particularly when it's fairly well known, and when blind Freddy can see it's a likely scenario that drones are going to kill surrendering or wounded Russians because it's more convenient, right?
In the interest of balance here, I think it's good to put out there because I've put on the previous point. I put on the question point, legalities, ? Ethics, ? What I think is important to state outright is what would I do in this circumstance? Am I personally judging any of these guys for doing things like that? Man, I have no idea what I would do. I don't know what it's like to be over there in their shoes. I'm not personally having a go at them. This is a discussion around legalities.
Right.
Ethics is a bit different. What sits right with you, etc. We're not sitting around here judging the Ukrainian military's tactics. Right. What we're doing is we're analyzing the legal aspects and what should and shouldn't be held. I mean, it's one thing to say, these are the rules of war, but if World War II taught us anything, it's hey man, sometimes the rules just they get, sorry, go Billy.
I think there's a part in that too that goes, well, what standard do we want to be held to? Because light of war, well, when we see, well, you didn't uphold this standard, so who the hell are you to say that we haven't done it? If we go to a hot war with China and Chinese drone pilots are now dropping these on diggers who are trying to surrender, who have been wounded by a drone, and they go, well, you didn't hold up one of your allied countries to this standard. How the hell can we ever turn around and go, well, you're not doing this? I think this is why people ask me all the time, why do you hold Ukraine to a higher standard than Russia? Because I believe that Ukraine are the good guys. I believe they're in the right, and they're an allied country of ours. I also hold every part of the coalition higher standard than the Taliban, and I behold every Ukrainian defender to a higher standard than the Russian soldiers. And I believe we're correct to hold them to that standard because at one point in time, probably sooner rather than later, our own soldiers allied with Ukraine in a war somewhere else will be held to this standard, and we should hold, no matter who it is, whether it's me or Coe or Ivan somewhere in the world, if we've got a standard, you enforce it and hold that standard. That is I know that might be a optimistic view of the world and how warfare works, but I think if we're going to bother having it, and if we are going to bother telling our adversaries this is the standard of war, well, we need to. It's no good having one side bound and one side not, and not holding your referee in a fight to have one do this and one not. I think the importance in this is countries looking in, going, oh, well, why would we then not? I think that's dangerous, and I think the danger in Ukraine doing this is exactly like we saw this time last year, or maybe a little bit later, with Wagner PMC and Yevgeny Prigozhin, when he came out and said, due to actions like this, we will now not be taking Ukrainian POWs. Now, I know there's a little bit in this because it was Wagner PMC, not the Russian army, and Prigozhin, whatever you want to say about this, but for just, case study of that, you see this, well, then if Wagner's PMC troops see that, well, why would you be taking troops when you go, well, this is how you treat it the other way? I think we need to see this as maybe more so than just a one-off event. And as far as if we're not willing to enforce this on ourselves or an allied nation, how the hell can we expect an adversary or allied forces of that adversary nation, how can we expect them to uphold this also?
It's classic, two wrongs don't make a right. And I think with that in mind, again, perfect segue from Willie, the riot control agent situation. Because now we have a situation where both sides have signed up and there's evidence of both sides. And again, the slippery slope of, oh, well, we just did a little bit. Oh, it's just it was just a couple of times. So to jog everyone's memory on the OPCW, so the Chemical Weapons Convention entered into force 29th of April 1997 and prohibits the production, stockpiling, blah, blah, blah. We went through all this stuff last time, Willie. And again, this is never under any circumstances to use chemical weapons. Specifically, riot control agents are not to be used as a method of warfare. Very clear. Does not include law enforcement. And the main anecdotal reason is, so if you drop a gas, like a grenade, and a gas comes out instead of an explosion, how do you know if it's smoke, choking agent? So they want to avoid a situation where soldiers that are hiding in trenches and bunkers are faced with that, as opposed to a law enforcement situation where rioters can flee a riot control agent, is the anecdotal descriptions I've heard. So chemical weapons, looking at these definitions will be important for not only question 4 here, where we talk about riot control agents, but question 5, which is the apparent sabotage, incidental release of toxic materials like ammonia, nitric acid fumes, etc., which we'll get onto in a sec. So again, defining the riot control agent, this is what Willie and I talked about in some detail in reference to all this stuff that's been popping up over the last couple of years, particularly the chloropicrin grenades, but also things like the video that we saw of the Ukrainians putting hydrogen cyanide in the freezer, and some other bits and pieces. So that's my segue into the riot control agent use for both sides. Glenn, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
Yeah. It's another good point, and I'm going to just disclose that I was also a copper for a little while, and whilst I was only in uniform for a year or so, I had the pleasure of being sprayed by my offsider on a couple of occasions. So I can see why they don't want to be using riot control agents in the trenches, because I was a crying, gibbering mess, right? But look, you're right, Kelly. This is the convention is very clear. And I had to refer to my weaponeering again overnight because I wanted to make sure I had some examples, right? But the people using it would be relying on the I think it's Article 9 of the convention, Article 2 sub 9, which is purposes not prohibited, and it talks about military purposes. So bang, military doesn't say military can't use it, but it's saying military purposes not connected with the use of these blah 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 as a method of warfare. So they're going to be saying that what we're doing is we're using it, it's a military purpose, but it's not as a method of warfare. The classic case is, and again, this is the military police hat now, take off the copper and put on military police, controlling PW, when civilians are being used to mask attacks, this is a big one that they drew back on a few cases in contemporary warfare where civilians are being used by the baddies to mask an attack by the baddies. You don't want to kill the civilians, so you hit them with the riot control agents. That then disperses the civilians, whatever, and you can then do whatever you have to do with the attack. Of course, that becomes a bit of a slippery slope, as you say, and those agents are suddenly being used on the attacking force as well, right? So, I'm not talking in the trenches in defence, but we're talking stretching the legality, or stretching the prohibitions to their limit.
And military also does a lot of like riot control stuff. When I was served on the 7th Battalion, we did a full course. Like I have used those agents, like, and not like I should say not firing at a crowd, but as far as being qualified to use them either from 40 mil, whatever, can use. Same with sandbags, same with whatever. So there's a military use beyond. The military does far more than just in the trenches fighting as well, where the police can't keep up.
That was the third dot point here: domestic riots in occupied territory.
Oh, bloody read your mind. Sorry.
Timor all the time, right? Or no, we didn't, but we were involved in using it in Timor. So
Solis as well.
Yeah, Solis as well. That's right. So look, there are those prohibited uses, not as a method of warfare. Of course, there's scope to exploit those. Where there's a prohibition, there's always a way, an attempted way to get around it. Right? That's the reality, and I think. That's pretty elastic, but the provisions are clear. The provisions are clear, not as a method of warfare. If I can't think of an example where you got people in these trenches, and Ukraine has reverted back to to positional warfare at the moment, at least, right? If I cannot think of a circumstance where either side could be lobbying riot control agents, and that's the definition of, as you said, it's pretty broad, right? It covers a whole lot of stuff, except anything in the schedules. The schedules just talk, I don't know whether they just talk about the countries making declarations as to what they don't believe a riot control agent is, right? But there's very few of them. All this stuff it's a broad brush riot control agents, right? So it's very hard to envisage a situation where lobbing this stuff into these trenches would not be in breach of the convention, and again, going back to my weaponeering books, I tried to find some examples in there, and let me just find the page. Chemical Weapons Convention. It talks about it just sort of goes into how they can't rely, like a state, a country, a party to the convention can't rely on the schedules saying, well, no, it's not a riot control agent because we've put this in the schedule. Well, no, the schedules don't. There's not much in there. Right, and the stuff that's in there is we know it's not riot control agents, so they're declaring the obvious essentially.
Yeah, and let's if I'm straight up and down with this, the only reason people are getting away with this is because it's a riot control agent, not mustard gas. Now, under these conventions, it doesn't matter whether it's seen as a chemical weapon. It doesn't matter if it's mustard gas or a riot control agent. It's seen as the same.
Yep.
The only reason that Ukraine and Russia are getting away with doing this is because it's a riot control agent that we know isn't lethal. Now, of course, it's being used in a form to get people out of, if you've ever been hit by this, which all three of us have been hit by this at times, you will get out of there as soon as you can, and you get the guys out of the bunkers, and then you shoot them with a lethal weapon. But let's not act like if Russia or Ukraine started dropping bloody mustard gas or some other gas that we wouldn't then be like, day one, be like, you can't do that, Putin, Zelensky, that we wouldn't. The only reason we're letting this slide is because it's chloroprictin. It's not anything else. That's the only reason I was holding it to it. But it under the laws, it doesn't matter from what I'm seeing.
So most of the time you use this stuff, it's non-persistent, right? So unlike mustard that sticks around for ages, that can be sampled and verified as used, riot control agents are non-persistent. Unless you've got a team that's going to go in there to sample and confirm, it's very hard. In most instances, it's not lethal unless you can't get away from it and you literally just choke. So we'll kill you. You can choke to death from this inhalation of this stuff. If you inhale enough of it, you can't get away from it, whatever. But what if other non-persistent, non-riot control agents, right? So short-term agents like choking agents, blood agents, are used that also don't leave much of a footprint. There's no team to verify. But we kill everyone in the bunker, not just cause them to flee and then try and target them with a drone. Now, how are you going to prove that? Oh, they just got caught. We don't know what happened to them.
Well, I guess that's the slippery slope of if you let it get away with at the low end, why would you not keep pushing that boundary? Like kids bloody learning on the playground, you learn where the boundary of play is and you push and push and push. Warfare is going to be exactly like this. Oh, no one said shit about using these K51. I think they're a K51 right control grenade. No one said anything about this. Oh, let's try this and let's see how far we can push it until next thing you've got full-blown chemical warfare. I think the law is pretty obvious that for military purpose, just none of it is allowed. And look, it's not proven. I don't know. Glenn's probably one to talk on what is beyond reasonable doubt of a weapon like this. But if you see a grenade that looks exactly like a K51 being dropped, then a cloud of dust and guys running out going, oh, fuck my eyes and I can't breathe, is that enough evidence to say that this is prosecutable for that? Like, I don't know. I don't know how far you'd need to push it.
Yeah, circumstantial cases can be very strong. That can be a very strong case, but you have to get all those little threads of circumstance. I'm not going to give you a big law lesson, but all those little threads of circumstance can join together and you get a conviction beyond reasonable doubt if the only available inference from all of those circumstances is that it's a riot control agent, right? Is that they've committed the offence. So, at the end of the day, it's a matter of getting all that. And I think the non-persistence thing is a big one. That's a hard one to overcome. It's a pretty important circumstance, right? If the stuff's dissipated and you can't prove that part of it, look at all the other circumstances. There's a gap there, and if that gap allows for another inference other than the fact that it's a riot control agent, then you won't get up. So it's again, this goes to why they're using it because it's
exactly,
and it's hard to pin on it,
and because no one's prepared to pull in up on it.
Yeah,
like no one's actually prepared. Like the Western world is obviously not prepared to go, hey, Ukraine, you're doing the wrong thing.
Yep.
And Russia's allies being China or Iran, well, yeah, they want to get away with doing their own shit, but also they are not prepared to say that, hey, you're doing the wrong thing either. I think that's a case which we've seen through every one of these questions is a huge problem.
Yep. And that's a great way to lead into the other part of this discussion, which is deliberate sabotage of now. Sabotage that results in a release incidentally versus sabotage that results in a release deliberately are two different things. Very hard to prove one way or the other. And the cases that we went through, that Willie and I went through, there's a bit of both in there. The effect you can have with a toxic nitric acid cloud or a toxic NOx cloud or heavy ammonia can be extremely lethal to the civilian population. So what are your thoughts on that, Glenn?
Again, it's a good one. Firstly, sabotage is attack, because all this comes there. If we're going to look at criminality, we have to look at the word attack. That comes up in the IHL and in the Rome statute. So sabotage equals attack, regardless of what the intention is. If they're sabotaging something, that's an attack. It's whatever the effects are is a separate question, but that's an attack starting point. To be chemical pharma, I'm just having a look at my notes here. Chemical, pharmaceutical, and other industrial facilities. There's always going to be the issue of what military is it a military objective? That's the first question, right? Is it a military objective? What military advantage is to be obtained by that attack? And then you have to look at the precautions to be taken in the attack. Precautions, so the old test of all feasible precautions must be taken in the attack to avoid the civilian injury and damage to civilian objects, etc. Right, so all feasible precautions, and then the rule of proportionality. So is the military, the anticipated military advantage to be obtained proportionate to the anticipated loss of civilian life, etc. Some of this stuff here, and like I saw some of the examples there,
Well, let me frame those for you specifically so you can talk to them.
Yeah, good.
The first one, which is claimed that ammonia storage tanks were attacked by Russians. So we have ammonia.
Yep.
Ammonia is a key ingredient if you want to manufacture your own nitric acid,
Yep.
to manufacture your own RDX, which is a very, very widely used high explosive, artillery projectiles, aircraft bombs, etc.
Yep.
PE4, C4. Nitric acid. Nitric acid's main job in life is to make fertilizers or make explosives and fireworks. So again, an extremely important chemical precursor for the manufacture of explosives or fertilizers.
Yep.
Ammonium nitrate. Its main job in civilian industry is as a fertilizer, can be very easily weaponized with nitromethane, aluminium to make truck bombs, to make whatever. So that is definitely something that can be used in the mining industry, etc. Again, another nitric acid one, unknown, and then another ammonia one, I think it was, but I'm not too sure on that. So we have, now there are examples where it's less clear, but in those examples, like, you're talking World War II, where you had the Operation Jedburgh behind enemy lines targeting sulfuric acid, nitric acid, so the Germans couldn't make their high explosives. Right? Very, very clear targeting of chemical precursors to disrupt and interrupt the production of material that goes in for the weapon. How do you see it applying in this?
Yep. Look, all of those examples, I don't think we can't dispute there's a military objective. The question is, well, an example I used in class actually for my students was the fertilizer plant in Sumi. When was that? Wherever my slides are, but ammonia, right? Ammonia can be used. It set this cloud of, well, the ammonia cloud. I think you had an image of it there. So straight away we have a military objective. Certainly, was the military advantage proportionate to the anticipated damage to the population, and were all feasible precautions taken? The Russians, this was a Russian one, I think, wasn't it? Yeah, the Russians warned the local mayor, and the local mayor sent out a thing saying, stay indoors, don't come out. And I understand the attack took place when wind conditions helped to dissipate it. So they either, I suspect intentionally, I hope intentionally, looked at the wind conditions to make sure it was dissipated. So they've taken a whole bunch of feasible precautions there, and probably all feasible precautions you could take. So even though I think Russia actually denied the attack, but regardless, actually, here we go. Anyway, regardless, Russia said that the Ukrainians had blown it up and sabotaged it themselves, blah, blah. If in fact it was the Russians that had done it, and the Russians warned the town anyway, so, there's a reasonable inference there. Yes, military objective, definitely proportionate, because, very little civilian damage because feasible precautions were taken, right? If it was the Ukrainians who had done it, again, this is the sabotage piece, right? The ammonia and chlorine storage, it must have been ammonia and chlorine in the same location. Nonetheless, the population was warned, the wind conditions were right, etc. Feasible precautions. We go back to bread and butter IHL here, targeting law. Is that legitimate objective? Yes. Proportionate? Yes. Seems to be, on its face, seems to be okay, right? The issue here is, I think, that additional protocol 1, this is back to the Geneva Conventions, the protocols, talks about dangerous forces. It doesn't cover chemical plants or petroleum refineries. Okay, so we're sort of just relying on first principles here. First principles being, proportionate, military objective, proportionate, all feasible precautions in the attack, etc. Some of the other ones there, was another one, Mykolaiv, is that? What other ones I think you just went through them? Sorry, just give me another couple of examples.
I think we can probably screen that. Yeah.
Was there a lubricant, like an oil lubricant plant or something? Was that? I wrote some notes.
There we go.
So there we go. Yep. Thanks, mate. Yeah. Well, look, you know what? if the first test, if there's a military objective, and that test is pretty easy to satisfy, right? Okay, does that thing make an effective contribution to military action on the part of the defending state, so the defenders, and does an attack on it offer a definite military advantage? Well, look, I think both of those tests are satisfied in all of those cases. Then we need to look at the proportionality, and the facts don't really actually. There's just we'll have to see what sort of it's easy to assess it in the aftermath, but the decision must be made before the attack. You can't look at it in the aftermath and go, well, only 10 people choked to death. Well, that's not good enough, right? I think a lot of these cases, unless they'd gone to the lengths that they went to at Sumi, at that fertilizer plant, I think it'd still be very hard to say that they've estimated the anticipated military advantage against the expected civilian casualties. I just think it's very hard unless, like, how are you going to really know what impact this stuff's going to have? There's like an element of recklessness here. I think that's not the test, but
you couldn't even assign responsibility to either side anyway. It would be so hard to prove.
Yeah.
There's so much plausible deniability, and there's this complete lack of evidence. You wouldn't be able to even establish that.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think, and Sumi's a classic where Russia denied responsibility and tried to blame Ukrainian nationalists, they said, or whatever. You're right, but still, whoever is doing the attack has those obligations. Those obligations apply to both sides, and even if it is Ukrainian nationalists, they have the same obligations, right? It doesn't, just because they're partisans or whatever, that doesn't mean they've got a free hand. If there's some degree of control being exercised by Kyiv, and there would be, there is, we know that, then they're covered by the same obligations. But with these attacks, it's really, I would argue, it's really hard to. Military advantage is easy on those examples, right? I think it's really hard to determine to apply the proportionality test when you don't know, and you can't even. I don't think you can even estimate what the impact of these dangerous forces are going to be. Like, you can get lucky and have the wind blow. What if the wind doesn't blow and it's stagnant? Everything just, and you have something.
It's so difficult to. It's all speculation.
Yeah.
Did they attack that plant to hopefully release some gas, and hopefully the gas affected some Russian soldiers or Ukrainian soldiers?
Yeah.
Or did they know that was a key production facility for whatever supply chain? Or did a weapons release malfunction occur on some aircraft, and it just happened to land on whatever? Like, we just don't know.
I think actually that's a really good point, and it's that the outcome, or the intended outcome, the intended battle space effect. If it was to deny one side the use of, or say it's the Russians try to deny the Ukrainians the use of that stuff to make weapons, then giddy up. If it's speculative on the part of the Ukrainians that the gas may hurt some Russians, suddenly the anticipated military advantage is dropping away rapidly, isn't it? Right. So I think it's a stronger argument on the part of the Russians that their military objective test is satisfied than it is the Ukrainians, that they're just hoping that some of that gas gets some Ruskies.
And probably most importantly, if there is any plausible way of showing that someone deliberately released gas specifically to target troops, you're in breach of the CWC anyway.
Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, look, you're spot on. It's that does fail the test. Just going into the next leg of targeting. Absolutely. Are there other IHL provisions which it's in breach of? And yes, there are. So look, the sabotage. If the sabotage is to deny the other side the use of that stuff to make weapons, giddy up. But what other scenarios are there beyond that make it a legitimate military objective? It's hard to see.
And what was the difference, Glenn, targeting petroleum or oil refineries?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one. I'm just having a look. I went back through the protocol.
Because we see Ukraine sending a hell of a lot of drones and munitions into both Crimea and into Russian territory.
Yeah.
Specifically targeting them.
Additional protocol. It's Article 56 of Additional Protocol 1. So it's one of the the old AP1 to the Geneva Conventions. It talks about dangerous forces, and it doesn't, because it hasn't kept up. It doesn't cover chemical plants and petroleum refineries. But as we know, attacks on petroleum refineries can have some pretty shocking effects on not just the environment, but on the people around those locations, right? Like it's chemical weapons, yes, we know that, but petroleum refineries, absolutely, and it's not addressed in there. So we have to then apply those same tests, back to first principles. And look, a petroleum refinery may well be a military objective if you're denying the enemy the use of it. If you're using it, again, back to the other argument, if you're attacking it with the intention that it might do some harm to the soldiers individually, whatever, like not just denying them the use of the resource, but to physically harm them, then you're now starting to get into some dangerous territory.
Yeah, I think that the military use case too. I was reading it as another lawyer talking about this, and he was talking about the energy grid and how modern militaries are more and more and more reliant on energy grids now, more so than ever. So when Russia was targeting Ukraine's energy grid and everyone's going, this is a war crime, this is a war crime. Well, no, any military in the world is completely reliant, well, to a degree, reliant still on energy grids, and modern military is becoming even more reliant on the energy grid. You can draw that conclusion. That is something that you can target.
It's called dual use, and you're absolutely right, dual use facilities. The problem, I did an analysis on this early on last winter, actually, when I was supposed to be in Ukraine over the winter. Yes, dual use. That's if it's used by civilians or military, absolutely. No, express prohibition. But Russian targeting, they still have to do a targeting go through the targeting process, right? The 6-step process or whatever. Through that process, the fact that they were just hitting every energy grid component, right? Boom, 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 such rapid succession. They clearly can't have gone through the process, firstly. And secondly, not all of them contributed to, like, they weren't all dual use. There was one out in the west. There was a military barracks nearby, which hadn't been occupied for years.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very difficult to say that's still dual use. Some of them had no military, a couple had no military nexus. But you're right. The dual use thing does say, look, giddy up. But the reason it's problematic for Russia because they were targeting just when winter comes, they start hitting the energy grid again, without enough time to do proper assessments, right? The proper, targeting assessments. So the inference is that they were doing it to have a crack at the Ukrainian people, and that's not allowed.
Yeah, look, we know that there was 2 points for this. We know that it was to deny the military electricity. We also know that it was to put the civilian population in the cold and in the dark, and to make them think Russia's going to win. Of course, we know that was the dual use of it, but overall, the targeting of this, it's like targeting a telecommunications tower and go, well, yeah, I know you guys all use, everyone in Ukraine uses WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram through Kyivstar, but also every single bloke on the front line is sending orders through fucking Signal, WhatsApp, and Telegram, and that goes under it. I'm actually surprised we don't see more effort. Personally, I'm surprised we don't see more effort to take out those communication grids too, through either hacking or direct strikes or whatever. But the legalities of it is definitely, as far as I'm aware, that it is a target.
No, you're right. Absolutely, dual use. Absolutely, and in fact, that goes again back to the military necessity, right? If they can demonstrate, even putting aside the dual use, if they can demonstrate some military necessity to target that energy grid, which isn't disproportionate to the impact it'll have on civilians, then there's a walk-up start straight away. Look at the just think about Rwanda, when there was a radio, I think it was a radio station putting out this message: "Kill all cockroaches." You remember that from the Rwanda, the Tutsi-Hutu conflict, right? And it happened in fact in Bosnia too. A Serb radio station was putting out this stuff, and the Yanks bombed it, and there was this big uproar. Civilian object and military radio stations, they can tell the population where to go in case of floods and stuff. Yeah, but it was also contributing directly to the deaths of all these people, right? So that passed the test, but there was an uproar. So you're right. There's a bit of a targeting isn't necessarily black and white.
It's hard, isn't it? but I think a lot of it comes down to it's almost like what feels right. Can you draw a military use? Therefore, it's okay. Like I think
pub test, mate. The old pub test.
Yeah, pub test. Yeah, it's a pub test for this. Fuel's being used by these tanks. You hit these fuel tanks. This is being used, could potentially be used to make this. It's also being used just for fertilizer because both Russia and Ukraine have a huge agricultural industry. That is also denying it's you've almost got three uses. Yeah, you're denying them for making weapons. You're denying them economically to fertilize their fields, and you've got then the cloud of poisonous gas. Glenn, what about if you're targeting something for economic reasons? Like, say I think the perfect example of this is Nord Stream. But secondly, like that fertilizer, the ammonia hit. Now that ammonia on the front line, look, we probably know that's not going to end up in bombs for that, in some of those areas. That is purely for farming. But that obviously has a huge economic effect on them. How does that work? And Nord Stream's, I guess, the best example.
Yeah, look, again, you have to go back to first principle, back to the two-pronged test of military objective, because it really is, it caters to the changing dynamics of warfare, right? It's so the first test is the object something that makes an effective contribution to military action on the part of the other side? Well, does some economic infrastructure make an effective contribution?
Yeah.
Does Nord Stream, was it Nord Stream 2 they attacked, I think? Does that make a contribution, an effective contribution? So that's pretty broad, right? To the other side. And whether the attack offers a definite military advantage to the attacking party. Well, that's sort of, does it make effective contribution, and does taking it out provide a definite military advantage? That's where economic attacks are a lot harder. Well, a lot harder. It's a lot harder to justify, I think.
I bet, because then what we say you're attacking America, we're bombing Wall Street. Yeah, it's full of civilians, but it also has a massive economic effect on your ability to fight. Like, to actually prove it and make it a targetable thing would be very difficult for whoever's lawyers doing it.
That's right, and then proportionality kicks in, and that's right. You're right. There's some real Nord Stream's quite a hard one, because that undoubtedly the gas. Well, Russia's war economy is relying on the Gazprom is propping up the war economy, as we know. There's a whole bunch of arguments there, and it all turns. These things always turn on the facts. I guess we have to have a look at it and see what after the event, right? Like lawyers will post-mortem stuff after the event for months or years over decisions that were made in minutes. Often.
Yeah. Oh, we're seeing that it's no different what we're seeing in Australia at the moment. The decisions made by Australian Special Forces years and years ago is now being dragged out a decade on. Yeah. And I'm sure, the scale of the war and the alleged crimes then were nowhere near the severity or the quantity of what's happening in this. And I'm sure for decades on, we're going to be drawing up shit going, well, who was the drone pilot of this, and who targeted this and that? Especially depending on what happens in the future with the ICJ with Putin and Maria Belova. That's going to be very interesting too, of who goes down, who's considered a propagandist, who's considered a combatant. There was and it doesn't matter if it was someone or not, but when Ashton Cirillo came out and said we will hunt propagandists, well, things like that need to be looked at with a fine-tooth comb too, and go, well, who do you consider, and what is and like you say, you need to add what is the military objective to this? Now, Prigozhin, you could say, yeah, he's propagandist and there's whatever. But if you're a YouTuber making videos, are you a legitimate target? And that's, in the new world order, this is things we're going to have to consider as everything is online and everyone can be a reporter.
Right, that's right. Which is why there's so much work going into new weapons, right? There's research going into. It started with drones, but that's gone beyond that now. Even there's honestly, there's a certain company was selling drones to Ukraine for surveillance of ISR purposes, and Ukrainians, being an innovative bunch, were attaching ordnance to them. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, there's issues with the end user certification attached to selling stuff to all this sorts of stuff comes up. But at the end of the day, right, these things will be looked at through the prism of, in hindsight, and they'll be looked at forensically, undoubtedly. There is an ex-Navy lawyer in Canberra, this goes to what you're saying, he passed away recently, but he was doing work in Rwanda, chasing down fugitives from the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, as recently as 2 years ago. and that wrapped up in 1997 or something, 98, or like, you know what I mean? So these things, years, decades later, these things come to fruition. People go, "Oh, hang on, that was bad," you know. Yeah.
Especially with smartphones and drones recording absolutely everything.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Yeah.
Which could be a good or a bad thing. In Ukraine, I discovered there's every man and their dogs out there recording war crimes. The journalists, they've got an app now where they can, if you see a war crime, you just use this app and you blah, blah, blah. Well, all these people recording the same stuff and taking the same statements of people, that's a defense lawyer's dream. Reasonable doubt, you know, like muddy the water. Yeah.
Well, I think personally, I think it's the end of conflict like this that we've got away with it previously. I heard a comedian today, but he's right. He said, imagine if there were smartphones and drones in Fallujah when we were there. Imagine that. It would look like what we're seeing in Gaza. It would look like what we've seen in Mariupol, and we wouldn't get away with it. And we're at the end of the line of these powers, these aggressive powers getting away with it, whether it's China, whether it's Russia, whether it's the US, whether it's, you know, whatever you want to say. We can't get away with it because now if we did that again, it would be all over the media. Every other thing that has happened in Gaza, Palestine, West Bank has barely been seen. But now everyone has a smartphone, everyone can live stream, everyone has a drone, whatever. You can't hide it. And I actually think this is the best thing since nuclear weapons to happen to war. Nuclear weapons, at least what I see it, were a fantastic thing to happen to war. If nuclear weapons didn't exist, the amount of hot wars we would have had of superpowers be huge. If Russia didn't have nukes, NATO would be in Ukraine, in my opinion. And with smartphones, because of we know how bad this is going to look on administrations, on countries, there's no way that Bush or Blair or whoever would have made these decisions knowing full well every Iraqi is going to be filmed going, what the fuck is going on here? And I think overall for, you know, I'm a humanitarian. Like at the end of the day, the reason I'm hard asking all these questions is I hate seeing footage of this happening. It's disgusting. And having seen it firsthand, you get a very different opinion on it, whether I was in Israel or whether I was in Ukraine or anywhere else in the world that I've been. A horrible thing to see live. And I think this is a good thing because it's actually cleaning up the mess that many countries make down the line and into the future. This has to be considered. If yourself as a targeter, you're probably considering now, hey, if we're going to hit this guy, holy shit, he's probably got surveillance. There's all people with cameras and drones. It's going to be on Telegram within 30 seconds, and we better make sure our fucking ducks are in a row.
No, you're right. And that's why I think so many headquarters nowadays, they'll have a lawyer and a PA officer, right? Because they want to know the commander, and they're making his or her decisions, wants to know what the public relations implications of that decision are going to be, because they're fully aware that this stuff will be all over the page one of the SMH tomorrow. You're right, and it's an accountability measure, and it certainly goes to their decision making and targeting, no doubt in the world. You know?
Yeah, gents, I've got to take off soon.
No, Kelly, I was going to ask if you had any more slides.
No, I'm done with slides.
Well,
that was great. Really enjoyed that.
No, I really enjoyed it. Glenn, thank you, mate. For those probably unaware, this is actually the first time we've met or spoken. So, mate, really, thanks for coming. I really do appreciate it. I've been writing questions down as we go. So for, maybe a future podcast. And Kelly, mate, thanks for all the effort you put in and making it as well.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Willie.
Yeah. Anything else you guys would like to say before we wrap up?
Love your work. I think it's a great idea. Great podcast.
Yeah, I think there'll be more content to talk about in the coming weeks to months, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Well, lads, thank you very much.
Thanks, Willie.
Really appreciate it. And this window will close, but don't worry about that. It's all saved.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
See you, boys. Bye.